Just less than 2,000 years ago, when the Roman military machine swept into Britain, locals were faced with a choice: resist or collaborate.
That initial post-conquest period must have been a hugely unsettled period and very shocking for people. They would have had contact with Rome before through trade, but that's a very different thing to having a whole legion stationed on your doorstep.
So they don't invade and say, you have to worship our gods, but you do have to fall in line. You do have to submit to them.
It's about your ability to speak Latin, to do the particular task that you are there to do.
Over the next few decades, in a series of impressive campaigns, the Romans extended their control over much of the island of Britain. And while Roman sources tell us quite a lot about certain individuals' acts of heroism or resistance, they tend to be quite quiet about what life was actually like for the ordinary people trying to live their lives in the fledgling Roman province of Britannia.
What we're seeing through the archaeology is the elite section of society engaging with the Romans. And we know that through what we see in the burials. We see a huge amount of Roman material culture influencing what people are being buried with.
Now, by utilising new scientific techniques, the team at Colchester Museum are helping to shed light on this tumultuous period in British history.
What's really exciting about the Decoding of the Dead project is that we can look at early Roman Britain.
And also to look into their daily lives through looking at their pathology, their general health and how this may have potentially impacted them on a day-to-day basis.
This will be the first time that we're looking at cremations. Really, it's kind of a gap in our knowledge.
Colchester at this time, which is called Camladunon by the Iron Age British, it is a complex place, and the British tribes, they're a complex society, and it is mainly through archaeology that we can understand this. The region of Essex, which is sort of tribally is affiliated with the Trinovantes, this is an important seat of power here at Camladunum. It's incredibly fertile land here, maybe one reason we see this huge farmstead, and that's the best way to describe it. And it's a huge area. It's one of the largest sort of occupied settlements in Britain, and we could call it an oppida, so a centre of power. It's a dispersed site, so we don't see this density of living like the Romans in towns. There's no urbanism like that. We see at Gosbecks, agriculture is taking place. And people are using the land in that sense. That's very different to what we find at Sheepen, another site within Camladunum, and here we see a lot of industrial activity and commercial activity. So if we look around Camladunum, we start to see that different spaces, areas, different parts of the settlement are being used in different ways.
Lack of written material means that we are forced to look to the archaeology. Unfortunately, Colchester has got plenty of Roman archaeology. The castle at Colchester was built by William the Conqueror on top of this. This is one of the most important Roman archaeological sites in the UK. And here at Colchester, they have also found plenty of burials.
Cremations did happen in Britain before the Roman period. We always refer to them as a uniquely Roman thing, but we do have Bronze Age cremations, we do have Iron Age cremations in Britain and in the rest of Europe as well.
We see that a lot of the time, not just men, but also women are buried with incredible material culture, so objects. And the closer we get to the point in time of real Roman contact, we see an increase in terms of Roman material culture coming in as well.
Claudius's invasion army was like nothing ever before seen in Britain. It landed in the southeast and swept up through Britain, arrived here in Colchester, and in its wake, there weren't just Roman legionaries fighting soldiers, but all sorts of men and women to provide support. There were craftspeople, there were people to handle the livestock, there were even the families of some of these legionaries. Everything, in short, required to lay the foundations for a Roman imperial settlement in Britain.
When the Romans invade under Claudius, they definitely know that Colchester is the place to go to. They understand that this is the seat of power. They realise that different kings, successive kings, have held power here. So the regions may have changed what they sort of had control over, but Camulodunum and the site here is incredibly important. And indeed, one of the reasons they established the Roman town within this place.
Britain becomes a part of a huge empire that stretches from North Africa to Turkey and beyond, and there are a lot of people that are moving, and they're moving for a variety of reasons. So you have soldiers, so the armies, the different legions are being moved around. You have administrators, so you need governors and you need people who can run the province, and then you have traders and merchants.
When the Romans arrive, they essentially do what they always do, is put down their blueprint for a town. And in some ways, this is a small area. So where modern Colchester is today is where the Roman town was. But within Camulodunum, so Iron Age Colchester, which was a much vaster area, this is a small place to some degree. And they do what they always do. They set up their systems of governance and everything else that is seen through different buildings. And it's a blueprint they use everywhere. When a colony is set up, land is given to retired veteran soldiers. And this is simply taken from the Iron Age Brits of the area, the Trinovantes. And indeed, we see this town and these walls eventually, not at the start, they later build walls around the town, but they really start to encroach on this land. I mean, they need it for all different reasons. One may be for farming, but as I say, also giving over to veterans. And of course, this is where we start to see the discontent of a lot of the Iron Age peoples here.
So part of this process of change includes things that people didn't have a choice over. So you had to pay your taxes, or, obviously you couldn't revolt against the Romans or things like that. But in other ways, I guess people carried on with some of their normal practices and habits. And then gradually they might change. So they might experience new forms of material culture like lamps, or new forms of pottery and new food like olive oil or wine. And then they might adopt those. So there's going to be this very gradual and very organic process of change. But there is always a power difference. There's a power difference between the legionary soldier and a non-citizen in that area.
The relationship of the Romans and how they're trying to politically sort of influence and engage with Britain is quite complicated. So they don't invade and say, you have to worship our gods. It's one interesting way of their diplomacy and how they work, but you do have to fall in line, you do have to submit to them, and they do officially ask for that. And indeed, when Claudius finally arrives in Britain and comes to Colchester, Roman Colchester, or where the town has been set up, the kings or the leaders have to submit to him there. And that means essentially there's a sort of there is a formal relationship with Rome. And those kings and at least the elites, if not the wider population, are benefiting from that relationship.
By this time, the Roman Empire was huge, stretching from Western Europe over here through Central and Eastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. It was a huge political and trading superpower. Travel within this space was easy, and it was a common occurrence.
We know that they travelled even to go and see places and monuments, so they travelled for leisure. And we know that obviously the army moved around a lot, and that we had slaves who moved unintentionally.
So there was a lot of mobility in that sense compared to other periods. The road network was relatively good, sea travel was relatively safe, so we can see that there was a lot of movement.
As Colchester began to be transformed in the 50s AD into a site of permanent Roman settlement, we start to learn more about the individuals at that time through personal items that we've discovered, or really importantly, their graves.
Burying the dead, sort of Roman funerals, is big business. There's a large population here, and people want to be buried in certain ways, and they certainly want to be buried in a Roman way. We have evidence, as elsewhere in Britain at this time, that in the late Iron Age, people are being cremated. And although this has been around for a long time, It is a Roman imported custom.
The Romans brought with it all this ritual, and the way of doing it was quite sort of prescribed and very specific to the Romans.
It's important to say it's how that cremation is undertaken.
Cremation in the past would have been a really laborious and quite taxing practice. It would have required a hell of a lot of fuel. You would have had to have really ideal conditions on the day, sufficient oxygen flow, the avoidance of rain. It was something that was really quite difficult to do and took a long time to sort of master and perfect.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
A cremation is such a visual thing, and especially, cremations could have taken place at night. You can imagine these huge fires, the smoke being put out, and it's a two-stage thing, I suppose. So you can burn the body, and there would be a ceremony around that, and then taking that body, or at least a sample of it, and putting it in, say, a vessel, normally ceramic, but could be other things, and placing it in the ground. So that sequence of cremation, that ceremony and that ritual is certainly a Roman import. Putting a body in the ground or burning someone, those practices have been around for a long time. But here in Iron Age, Essex and Colchester, that's what we're seeing, a Roman imported burial custom.
Generations of archaeologists have been finding pots containing the cremated remains of people from this Roman period for decades. Now, they've been regarded with interest, but there's never been any way of analysing what was in those pots until now. Cutting-edge scientific methods are now enabling archaeologists to open up those pots and learn more about the people whose remains lie inside them. The project's called Decoding the Dead.
Cremation rites were the predominant burial rite for large parts of British prehistory, but we don't actually know that much information about it because they weren't considered to be a strong source of archaeological information. So quite often they've been overlooked and they haven't been utilised. But actually what they can tell us is a lot of information about a burial rite that was really important that we've never been able to establish before. And what makes them so special is that you can use them to reconstruct an entire funerary sequence. So you can use them to establish the building of the pyre, the deposition within the grave, and reconstructing aspects of ancient life and these ancient societies that we weren't previously aware of.
The museum has an amazing collection of cremation vessels, some still with the cremated remains, and in well over 100 years these have just not been analysed, they just haven't been looked at.
The idea is that we have all these new scientific approaches that we haven't had before that can be applied to cremations, and we've brought together specialists from all these different fields.
As the osteologist, my job is to analyse all the bone that has been excavated and try and identify and reconstruct the lives of these people. When lots of people think of cremations, they think of ashes and dust, but actually this is a 20th century concept. In modern crematoriums, they use a pounder to actually grind the bones down. But in the past, what you would have had left over is quite a large amount of fragmented human remains that we can then analyse.
Through this combination of bone and isotope analysis, the team are hoping to find out much more about the people who settled and died in Britain's first Roman colony, and potentially change what we know about some of the earliest Roman settlers in Britain.
An essential part of this project is the isotope analysis. Basically, in the early part of our development, our bones get specific markers based on the climate and geology around us, things like the water you drink or the food that you eat. And what we can do is from these specific bones, and in this project we're looking at strontium isotopes, we can look at these isotope signatures and we can determine the climate of where that person grew up. So we might say this person clearly grew up in a much warmer climate than the British climate. So to find these isotopes, it's only specific bones in the body that have them. So it's either in the teeth or in the petrous bone, which is a bone in the skull located by the ear. And in cremations, you can only really use petrous bones because they're quite big and bulky.
One of the exciting things about this project is that we can also look not just at the isotopes, which tell you about geographical origin, but also the overall health of that individual and their age and their sex. So it's quite interesting to work out whether, if we spot an immigrant, for example, is that individual male or female? So in the past, we may have thought mainly men move into a new province because they're soldiers or merchants, but actually women could have travelled with them or children could have travelled with them. Getting all that osteological information as well as the isotope information is really helpful.
In the Decoding the Dead project, we have 36 burials that we've been looking at in detail. And the reason why we chose these burials is because they represented quite a diverse range of individuals, not only specific to the bones, but also to the ceramic pots and finds that they were buried with. So because we were unable to look at every single individual within the population, we wanted to extract a really representative sample. Amongst these human remains, there could be potentially multiple individuals within one pot. So even though there's 36 burials, there could be more individuals in total. Of the 35 individuals that I've identified so far, 6 of them are female and 12 of them are male and 21 of them are unidentified. So the interesting thing about this information is that in cremation analysis there is a tendency to sex individuals as females because of bone shrinkage. Quite often you would presume that an individual may be potentially female because the bones aren't as robust. But as we're seeing here at Roman Colchester, actually, we have more males than we do females. And with regards to age, we've got quite a diverse group of individuals at Roman Colchester. 23 of them have been identified as 18 years and over. 7 of them have been identified as 40 years and over, and then 9 of them have been identified as less than 13 years of age. Even though we have the majority of individuals have been aged at 18 years and over, this doesn't necessarily mean the community was made up of mostly adults. It just means that they're easier to identify from the bones that we have, and they have a better state of preservation. So quite often we do find that younger individuals and those who are from 0 to 13 years of age often are invisible within the archaeological records, specifically with cremations, just because their bone is so fragile, they don't tend to survive as well. I've identified 2 individuals who have porotic hyperostosis, and this manifests as pitting within the cranial fragments and is associated with nutritional deficiencies, so potentially an insufficient diet, or maybe even the individuals were quite unhealthy. So what this might mean is that these individuals had an insufficient diet, or potentially that they generally weren't particularly healthy people. Another individual I've identified from Roman Colchester has something called ankylosing spondylitis, and this is a joint disease that affects the spine. And how it manifests is essentially extra bone growth that stops the vertebral bodies from moving and actually joins them together. Now, this individual would have found it quite difficult to perform everyday tasks because essentially their mobility and their flexibility would have been significantly reduced. It's quite easy to assume that individuals who have pathology were potentially of quite low social standing because they were quite unwell and they weren't as fit as other people within the community. But what we have to understand is that in order for pathology to manifest within the skeleton, that individual would have had to have it for quite a number of years. So what we could potentially argue is that that individual was potentially of high social standing because they lived for so long with this condition, because they were cared for and potentially received treatment.
Bone analysis has told us a little bit about who these people were. Now I've come to visit the team at Colchester Museum to find out more about the latest results of the isotope analysis. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hi, Dan.
Hello.
Thanks for the exhibition. Just opened?
Just opened. Yep. Let's have a look.
Let's have a look. We had all this human material for decades, but we've never really been able to do much with it. Is this like your generation can finally go, right, let's decode this stuff?
Well, I suppose what's special about the project here with Colchester Museums and the University of Reading is that we're exploring the antiquarian collections of the museum. So these things were dug up, in some cases, over 100 years ago, and they've been very carefully cared for that time. But it's applying that new eye, it's new techniques come along, I suppose new interest, and we suddenly saw this opportunity to really investigate and say something about early Roman Britain.
So incredibly exciting. It sort of justifies us hoarding everything, doesn't it, and saving everything. It goes from being bits of smashed and burnt bone to being essential research material.
It's exactly that, we do never know. And What's interesting is this is application of science, archaeological science, and as most people know, science is always evolving. And it is fantastic that we have these. So what we don't have is archaeological context, so any modern excavation would record that, where these things have come from in the ground, the relationship. So we don't have that, but these bones still have something to say, and modern osteologists, modern scientists can extract these hidden stories.
Carolina, what stories did you extract from these bones? I'm so excited about this.
So it's all kinds of different information. So the osteology, like Glyn is referring to, is basically, when you look at a Roman cremation, as you can see, it doesn't look anything like what you expect a cremation to look like. It's not ash, it's actually bone fragments.
And that's good news for you.
That is great news for us, because what it allows us to do is osteologists can identify, well, they can look at identifiable bits of bone fragments, and they can actually work out occasionally what the biological sex of the individual is, what their age is, sometimes even different kinds of pathologies, so diseases that they might have lived with. And then if a particular bone survives, the petrous bone, we can actually now do isotope analysis, which basically lets us know where that individual spent the early part of their years, and gives us an idea of migration and movement in the Roman world.
That's so cool. Where is the petrous?
So it's,
where's my petrous? Here.
well, it's right by your ear, so it's on the skull, and you've got two. So if we're lucky enough that even one of them survives in the cremation, and it's actually quite exciting because it's the first time we've ever done this with Roman cremation. So isotope analysis to inhumations has been done before, and certainly to Roman inhumations, which, as I mentioned, are later in date generally, to look at migration patterns, and really interesting results have come from that. The issue with cremations is that the firing of the bone actually impacts those isotopes. So the ones that we would normally use to determine migration, oxygen and lead isotopes, we can't use in cremations, but we can use strontium isotopes. And that has been done to cremations before, but sort of prehistoric cremations in Britain, where the movement is localized to Britain, but it's never been done to Roman cremations, where we're really looking at movement on a scale completely not seen before that.
Right, this is so exciting, because Britain for the first time is part of a transnational empire stretching all the way from the Middle East, Syria, and even beyond, right up to Carlisle.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do get evidence for that. So of all the cremations that we examined, about 25% of them seem to not have come from Colchester.
Right. Okay, so this is the big news, the big headline grabbing news. What did you find?
Well, it's interesting. Carolina says that 25% of these individuals that we studied in our sample were not from Colchester, Essex, or Britain. In some ways, is that the big headline? Well, it's great, it's really interesting, but that's what we should have expected. We know Colchester is this centre in the really early Roman period in Roman Britain. We know there's this movement. We know the military, for instance, move huge numbers of people. So it's, in a way, it's good that our evidence wasn't contrary to that. We have a face pot here, which is very, very interesting. So these are quite unusual cremation vessels. This chap is quite early in date, so he's sort of later 1st century AD, and just to, you'll know about this, but of course Boudica came to Colchester, the rebellion burnt the town, so it's just a little bit later than that, or around the same period. So this is a cremation vessel, but they turn up a lot in Germany, and they are associated with the military. So, just looking at this object, we would suggest, maybe there's a chap inside here, and maybe they were a soldier. And what's particularly interesting about studying this cremation is that they were identified as a male, and they actually originated from Italy. So studying their isotopes, so the petrous bone, the isotope analysis, we know that they're from maybe the region of Italy. So that's really, really interesting, and it supports that narrative.
It's also interesting looking at that 25% and, of course, the 75% that are local to Colchester, because they really range. So Glyn was talking about these face pots, and he's absolutely right. But we looked at petrous bones of other individuals in face pots, and they were actually local. So it just shows this blending of people who are coming from abroad and settling in Colchester, and the locals doing a lot of the similar things. And of the examples that we have here, actually 2 of them are not local, which would be the face pot and this local greyware vessel. So actually this person, or one of the individuals here, there's actually 3 individuals here, was not from Colchester, but they are being buried in a kind of very local pot. And then these two at the bottom, in this glass vessel and this lead vessel, those are, two of the most expensive kinds of, cremation vessel or urn that you could have, and they're actually local. So it's these local people, adopting this very highly Romanized, burial tradition very early on, as Glyn says, but, it's also to great expense.
Carolina, it's such an exciting project for so many reasons, but one of the great pleasures must be to take a collection that previous generations of curators and storekeepers have thought were basically pretty worthless and breathing life into them. You've given these people a bit of humanity back.
Yeah, it was one of the most important parts of the project, and I think it's very easy when you go to a museum and you see an inhumation or a skeleton, you can immediately associate with them as a human and an individual and a person, but it's a lot more of a struggle when you've got a cremation and you can't see a face, and that was really what we were trying to do. And we talked a lot about how the Romans have this tradition. The way they deal with death is that they mourn and they remember their ancestors a lot throughout their lifetime, and part of it is telling their stories and keeping them alive through memory, and in a sort of odd kind of way. That's what we were trying to do with this exhibition, was keeping that memory alive and telling the stories of our ancestors in Colchester in the best way that we can, which is through science.
What's so exciting is these bones aren't going anywhere. So what are you going to be able to come back? Your descendants will come back and look at these bones, and what might we one day be able to tell from them?
Absolutely. I mean, in 100 years of them being stored, we can now tell you, from how old they were to if they had a, back pain that they struggled with, their general sort of stature and their sex and where they come from. So, who knows in 20 years and what we'll be able to say. And that's why it's so important to keep these collections, and really what this project was about.
And the project really has looked at a fairly small sample, although we were very careful to make sure it was broad in what it picked up. So you'll see here we've got all different types of vessels to try and see if there was correlation between expense in a funerary urn and how that cremation was undertaken and who they were. But it's a small sample, and there are many more in the museum's collections, and we hope now to further the study and actually bring in what I was talking about, some excavated sort of modern excavations of cremation, so we can compare and contrast and even go further afield around Colchester and to rural sites, so we can compare urban and rural and see again, are there different practices going on? Are these people less or more Roman? What's going on there? So I think there's huge mileage in this to really get under the skin and into the bone of these individuals.
That sounds like a really interesting expansion of the project. Looking forward to seeing how that one goes.
Excellent, thanks.
Thank you.
Archaeology is showing us that for many Britons, certainly here in Colchester and around it, the years following the Roman invasion was a time of, well, if not welcoming it, accepting it. And you see British people starting to use the material culture, the objects, the food, the trade goods of this new vast empire they've been incorporated into. What's really interesting about this project at Colchester Museum is it shows us how British and Roman cultural and religious ideas start to become fused together, certainly around burial practice. Does this perhaps mean that Romans and Britons were becoming one decades earlier than we might previously have thought? The work done by these archaeologists and osteologists is ongoing, and I'm absolutely certain that I'll be back here in the years to come to find out more. It's one of the most famous historic sites in England, Hadrian's Wall. Over 80 miles of wall, turrets and forts, stretching from coast to coast across northern England. Mile after mile of stone marching over the horizon, an icon of Roman dominance. And now, it's celebrating its birthday. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain, and as a Roman historian tells us, he put many things right, and he was the first to build a wall from sea to sea to separate the Romans from the barbarians. But Hadrian's Wall is also an enigma. To understand this familiar but surprising structure, I'm going to explore 3 key sites along its length. Arbea on Tyneside in the east, Chester's in the heart of Northumbria, and Birdoswald in Cumbria as the wall approaches the west. I'll dig into some of the main questions about this 1,900-year-old structure. Why was the wall built? Barbarian land. Who were the people who lived here?
For women.
This is aggressive defence.
What happened when Roman rule in Britain came to an end? Did this wall come tumbling down? And don't worry, I'll also be seeking out the influence of Hadrian's Wall in modern times, from the Eagle of the Ninth to Game of Thrones. When the Emperor Hadrian came to his province of Britannia in AD 122, there was a profound change happening to the empire. Up until then, in the 150 years since Augustus, the first emperor, the Roman Empire had no real borders. It had just grown and grown, with no apparent limit. But now the empire was increasingly coming up against obstacles. Powerful rival empires in the east, resurgent Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and tough, warlike people in what is now Scotland. They had to ask themselves the question, did they want to go on expanding indefinitely? And the answer for Emperor Hadrian was no. He wanted to consolidate, dig in, fortify a line around that empire. And that is why this is the northern edge of an empire in its prime. One that stretched from here across thousands of miles of Roman-controlled land and sea to the sands of the North African desert. I'm starting my investigation of Rome's northern wall at Birdoswald, a well-preserved fort built 1900 years ago in Cumbria. Joining me by one of the main entrances is Rob Collins from Newcastle University. So this is obviously one of the big gates here.
Yeah, this is the east gate at Birdoswald, and one of the best gates along the entire wall, really.
It's huge, isn't it? It's a double. I thought these were meant to be defensive positions. These massive big gates.
Yeah, this is a gate, but it's also a monument. You have to imagine this thing standing 2 or 3 stories tall. And you can see the quality of building in these gates. So those stones there that make the pier for the arch are very nicely shaped. You've got this little Springer stone, and actually the first voussoir, the first bent stone, which would form the arch over the whole gate.
Is this the idea? You're kind of entering or leaving the Roman Empire and they want you to know about it?
Well, in some cases, but actually it's not just the empire, it's a fort. You know, this is a large settlement full of 500 soldiers. You know you're coming into military space when you walk through a gate like this.
So we've got 500 men here, and this is one of how many castles on the wall?
There are 17 to 20 forts along the wall, those fortified garrisons. Yeah, a castle in a medieval sense.
Birdoswald follows the classic fort design of Hadrian's Wall. It has curved corners, giving it a playing card shape. There's large gateways on the east, west and south sides, and its northern edge runs along the line of the wall. There would have been a fortified gate here, giving access to the lands beyond the wall. According to Roman sources, there was unrest in northern Britannia in the early 2nd century AD. It's possible the wall was built, in part, to demarcate hostile tribal groups from those who were allied to Rome, like the Brigantes, who appear to have been the largest group in that region of Britain.
With Hadrian's Wall, you get something new. You're getting monumentality, and in stone. So all of a sudden, local people are encountering very large, very solid fortifications. And if that isn't the worst bit, they've then got this massive entire wall that's cut the island in half. They can no longer just simply move their flocks from field to field if they're living locally. It's presenting a whole new way of life.
How many men would have manned this as a defensive belt right across this part of England? How many would there have been?
It's tough to be certain about numbers at any given time. Strength reports can sometimes lie, but you're looking at really a minimum of 12,000 men.
It's a big deal.
It's an army in and of itself, just based on this line on the wall.
Yeah, that's one army in one small corner of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about those 500 men who would have been here?
Well, what's great about this fort and most of Hadrian's Wall, in fact, is we have hundreds of inscriptions that often name the units that are in occupation. And here at Oswald, the most famous unit, the one that was here the longest, is a unit of Dacians. So Dacia is part of the Roman Empire, which is now modern-day Romania.
Wow.
So the Romans were really good about redistributing the manpower, I think we could say, of potentially, the most dangerous element of a population, those young men who have lots of energy and spirit and maybe not so much sense, putting them in the Roman army, shifting them to a different part of the Roman Empire where they can do the job of the empire and not endanger the empire.
Hadrian's Wall didn't begin as a huge stone structure. Initially, in this part of the wall, it actually began as a turf wall. You can see the remains of it here, a big mound of turf and soil. And it was only perhaps when Hadrian came to visit himself that the plan changed. The turf wall was turfed out and a massive stone wall was built just over there, 50 meters to the north. The legionaries who built the wall often left marks that didn't have an obvious military purpose. Rob, why is there a huge penis on the wall?
Well, it's a fantastic bit of what some people would call graffiti, but I think it might be better to see this as a magic symbol, as a symbol of protection. The Romans actually put these things all over their empire. So anywhere you travel in the Roman Empire, I would challenge you, you should probably see a phallic symbol someplace where the Romans were building.
But this is not just graffiti carved out of the wall, this is a relief. This is a stonemason has been to work on this.
Yeah, this has taken a bit of time for probably a legionary soldier to carve out of the stone. And actually, if you think of it then as a protective symbol, because that's what a phallus is often meant to do. It's meant to protect a wearer if you have it as an amulet. If it's carved on your house, it's supposed to protect your home. Here we have it carved into the wall. They're putting some magic protection into the wall. And it kind of changes things a little bit when you think it's not just a massive physical barrier, but actually maybe they're trying to imbue it with a bit of magic too.
Speaking of massive physical barrier, it's now, 2 meters tall here. How high do we think it would have been?
We think it's about 4 meters tall at its full height.
So it's double this?
Yeah, double this. So you have to really consider this as a barrier. And it's not just a wall. So anyone trying to cross the wall, they've got to go across a massive ditch. They then have to climb the wall. They then have to get a little bit further afield, and then they've got to go over a mound, down a ditch, and up another mound called the vallum. And so there's 3 major obstacles there for crossing the wall if you're not welcome.
You think of Roman legions not fearing anybody or anything, and yet to invest that much time and effort in creating this huge defensive belt, something they didn't like up here.
Yeah, it's a massive investment of manpower to build this thing, and not just for 1 or 2 miles. It's 80 Roman miles long, a bit more than 72 modern statute miles. So it's not a quick decision or a cheap build.
The area around Oswald is the best place to see a continuous section of Hadrian's Wall, as the Romans planned it around 122 AD, with its large forts and smaller mile castles. Rob and I are heading a couple of Roman miles along the wall to Mile Castle 48, positioned above the steep-sided Poltros burn. A railway embankment built by the Victorians now follows the line of the wall. Coming in now through the south gate, heading north through the wall. Is it me or is this fort built on the skew a little bit?
It is a little bit wonky, and it was for the Romans too. You can look at the stones there on both outside walls.
Yeah.
And you can see they're at an angle. So the Romans built to the slope.
Right, so it hasn't just subsided.
There's no subsidence. This is exactly how the Romans built it.
Why would they have built on a forward-facing slope like this and on the higher ground up there?
So it looks a bit odd now. We've got a train line in front of us, the woods blocking the view. But actually, if you think about where we are, we're right beside this really narrow defile, this burn, the Poltros burn. And actually, it's positioned very well to watch people going up and down that burn in terms of people who might sneak in, people who might sneak out. So while it looks silly to a modern viewer, if you think in terms of how people moved in antiquity, people who might not want to be caught, actually this is a really good position.
And out there, where the railway embankment is now built on Hadrian's Wall, through those trees, that is
Yeah.
the barbarians.
That is Barbaricum, the land of the barbarians, where the empire ends and barbarianism begins.
And what signifies a barbarian? Is it their culinary taste, the way they dress?
That comes into it, but it's actually quite simple. For the Romans, a barbarian is anyone who isn't Roman. But it's not so much an ethnic or racial attitude because they're not banned from the Roman Empire. The Romans are actually surprisingly inclusive in the ancient world. So as a barbarian, you can become a Roman citizen.
And if you're a barbarian farmer, could you bring your flocks through here?
That's what we don't know. What we really need is some evidence showing that. But this wall makes it very hard to move your flock of sheep back and forth if you need to.
And speaking of wall, what's this extra bit of wall here? Is this a later addition? Why have they walled up some of this gateway to the north?
Yeah, so this big fantastic gateway gets narrowed to a simple postern, just one person portal.
Yeah, just here, yeah.
And that becomes a control point, really.
Is that because they're scared about sort of giant forces crashing through here?
It could be, but if you also consider that by blocking this gate, making it so just a single person can come through, you're really reducing the usefulness of this gate. That forces anyone with wagons of goods, large herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, to go to those forts and go through the gates at the forts, where there's lots of soldiers.
How did people come and go? Is there a system of passes or passports, paperwork?
We know from other frontiers, Egypt especially, where they have straka, bits of pottery with messages painted on them, that this would act as a pass. So there is a paperwork, a pass that an officer would sign that would allow you access in and out of the Roman Empire.
Just like modern borders, there could have been quite the administration up here.
Absolutely. And also potentially, a bit of corruption as well. Because actually, there's no major general that's sitting here. So this might be a lucrative position for a very lowly soldier if they want to make a little bit of extra cash.
Life for those soldiers manning the lonely mile castles must have sometimes felt quite remote from the protection of the larger garrisons. This reconstruction of Mile Castle 48 shows how tightly packed and hunkered down these little forts were. So even though this is a solid feeling structure, it's still quite small, and I can imagine on certain nights here or mist days it feel quite isolated. But are there accounts of people from the north coming and attacking the garrisons here, slaughtering them, raids, full invasions?
We don't have many historical accounts of battle. We have a nice account from Cassius Dio when the Caledones crossed the wall. And so we know there's the odd invasion, but this could be something which is a daily occurrence, a small skirmish as a Roman patrol party and raiders meet, or it might be something that's very rare. And of course that can change over time.
Remember the East Gate at Bird Oswald? Well, this is how it would have looked in its prime. I've headed east to the remarkable reconstruction of a gateway on the wall, built by the mouth of the River Tyne at South Shields. This is a huge Roman base at Arbea. It gives a clear image of just how imposing Rome's frontier was. But I've come here to see something rather less monumental. Tucked away in Arbea's museum are two remarkable tombstones that reveal deeply personal stories about the people who travelled from across the empire to live and work around Hadrian's Wall. To help me decode the details is curator Alex Kroom, starting with a monument put up by a grieving husband.
This one is the tombstone of Regina. So it says, to the spirits of the departed, Regina, freedwoman and wife of Barates from Palmyra in Syria. And she was of the nation of the Catibaloni, who come from southeast England, and she lived 30 years. But what's particularly interesting about this tombstone is that it's actually a bilingual one. This is the only one known from Roman Britain. And the line underneath in Palmyran Aramaic says, freedwoman of Barate, alas. But it's quite interesting that the Aramaic inscription just refers to her as his freedwoman and not as his wife.
Was she like to have been enslaved and sort of freed by her husband, do you think? Or do we...
He probably bought her as a slave, but that at some stage decided to free her and then marry her.
Amazing amount of detail here. What can we tell about her life and her status?
Well, she's sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, which is a very characteristic type of furniture for women in particular. She's got her jewellery on, nice bracelets, but she's opening a box there. You can see the sort of the keyhole for lockbox. So this is showing that she's got money. And then on the other side is a basket of wool, and in her hand she's got the distaff and the spindle. So this is a very female occupation, is spinning thread. So this is showing her that she's a very womanly, wifely person, though probably as an ex-slave she's getting her slaves to do that, and she's no longer having to do it herself.
She's overseeing it.
Exactly.
And there's a second tombstone, one that captures the relationship between two members of the army.
This is a really fine sandstone, so it takes a lot of detail, and you can see the influence of Syrian tombstones in it, from the amount of folds in the cloth and all the creases in the mattress cover. But this one again, this one is a tombstone to someone called Victor, who was the nation of the Moors from North Africa, Mauritania, and he lived 20 years. He was a freedman from a man called Numerianus, who was a soldier, just a cavalry soldier from the first Ala of Asturians. Ala just means it's a cavalry regiment, Asturians as a tribe from Spain. And Numerianus devotedly conducted Victor to his tomb, showing that they must have had a very close relationship.
So amazing. His former slave, they're obviously so close, he erects this beautiful memorial to him when he's dead.
Yes, Numerianus is not an officer, he's just a rank-and-file soldier, and yet he puts all his money into creating a tombstone like that.
So we've got a former slave from southern England, we've got a Syrian, effectively, from what we call the Middle East now, Spanish and North African. What a collection of people would have been here.
Yes, and that's just 2 tombstones.
It's remarkable being able to decipher the stories of these people, whose very different lives brought them to Hadrian's Wall. Stone is so much more durable than human flesh and bones. So whenever I'm at Hadrian's Wall, I can get distracted by the sheer amount of stone, the military engineering, but I don't think enough about the men who manned those walls, who were barracked in those forts. But thankfully, occasionally we do find other bits of stone that do give us an insight into the men and women that were here. This remote outpost of empire, from thousands of miles apart, brought together by their language, their beliefs, their fashions, their tastes, but also their obligations to that empire and the advantages they derive from it. From the fascinating human stories revealed at Arbea, I'm moving west to the central section of the wall, an unusual fortress, Chester's. Like all the major forts, it was added to the basic design of the wall a couple of years after construction began, possibly on the orders of Emperor Hadrian. But Chester's was specifically designed for fast-moving shock troops. Dr. Simon Elliott is helping me interpret its layout. So who are the men that are living in these buildings?
Well, you're in the middle of a Roman barrack block for cavalrymen. So actually these are barrack rooms and stables at the same time. So what the Romans did, because it was convenient and practical, was that the cavalrymen would have stayed in barrack blocks like this. Each is a barrack room. Each barrack room would have had 3 men, and interestingly, the horses in there as well.
I think you'd probably quite like to live so close to your horses. On a cold winter's day, you get the heat from them.
Absolutely, yeah. So the horses on the bottom, 3 horses in here, then a mezzanine level above, sort of with a wooden floor, and that's where the men slept. If you imagine that you're based here, but you sort of originate in the blazing heat of Roman North Africa, and you find yourself here in the freezing cold of a British winter, in the wild west of the Roman Empire, you're going to love having those natural radiators below you.
Are they doing big cavalry sweeps? Are they riding out, raiding, scouting?
That's exactly right. So basically this is aggressive defence. One of the really, really interesting things about this Fort Chester's is 3 of the 4 gateways are actually proud north of the wall. So this is where the aggressive defence comes from, where the flying cavalry columns sort of shoot off into the far north to take on the natives who are rebelling occasionally against the Roman presence in the north of Britain.
So Hadrian's Wall seems to have different purposes, and many historians disagree exactly what it's for, but this suggests this is about projecting hard power.
If you think about this 80-mile long physical barrier with its 158 turrets along it, with its 80-mile castles, with its 17 forts. That is a massive investment in time and money. So to me, this has got to be a hard military barrier. But military barriers aren't just about standing sort of on top of the wall, stopping people coming through. You have to have an aggressive defence to stop people even getting the chance to come to the wall in the first place.
As I said in the First World War, our front line is the enemy's wire.
Absolutely right, yeah. And this is a prime example of that from the Roman world.
Kind of trying to dominate no man's land beyond.
Probably all the way up through the Scottish borders up to the sort of Forth.
It's remarkable how many expensive resources the Roman Empire poured into its northern frontier. Nearly 500 cavalrymen and their horses were stationed in this fort alone. It's an indication of the vast commitment to this defensive project in terms of men, animals and infrastructure. And a key part of that infrastructure was the management of this vast enterprise. Administration was one of Rome's greatest exports, and it created unified, predictable processes right across the empire. So this looks different to the barracks area.
This is called the Principia, so it's the headquarters building for the Roman fort, and you have a Principia in every single Roman fort everywhere in the Roman Empire.
So if you're a new officer arriving, you're a bit wet behind the ears, it doesn't matter, you can get straight into it.
Absolutely, yeah, you know exactly what you're going to go. You'll know exactly which office you're going to go into. You'll know exactly within the office where all the materials are to do your work sort of are, because you've done it exactly the same everywhere else in the Roman Empire you've been.
And this is the beating heart of the camp.
It is, it's actually physically right in the middle of the camp. But one of the rooms here is my favourite room. So let me show you my favourite room. It's right over here. This is called the Chapel of the Standards.
Ooh, this is where the units standard are, or we got like a flag today.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the holiest of holies for this particular military unit, because right in front of you here you'd have arrayed the standards, which would only come out to be used when they're actually on campaign. But also, even more importantly, you'd have a bust of the emperor, so this is where the commander of the unit would come and say a small prayer to the emperor to give them some good luck before they went fighting the Britons of the far north. But within this space, the holiest of holies, there's an even holier place, and that's behind us here.
All right. That's the strong room.
That's the strong room, absolutely right, yeah. This is the vault in the Chapel of the Standards where the pay chest is kept for the military unit.
So you've got the standards, the symbols of Roman Empire, and then you've also got the cash. The two twin pillars of Roman power.
Absolutely right, yeah. I mean, basically, without that, there'd be no soldiers here. But occasionally, you need even more luck. So let me go and show you something just as important as this. And it's got a colloquial name as well. It's called the Chester's Chap.
Oh, it's another penis.
So this is a good luck symbol, the ultimate good luck symbol for the Roman military unit who are based here.
Well, wherever you find dicks, you find Romans. And that's sitting proud, if you don't mind me saying, on the pavement here, isn't it? It's not hidden away.
Dan, that is the largest phallus in Roman Britain.
Crikey. Despite the macho good luck symbols, legionaries liked their luxuries too. Life on the wall could certainly be extremely tough, but the Roman army did provide the chance to relax and bond with your comrades. What a beautiful setting this is.
Well, Dan, you're walking into a Roman bathhouse.
Is that what this is?
This is a bathhouse. This is one of the best Roman bathhouses actually in the whole of Roman Britain. It's absolutely amazing. Look at the view as well with the River Tyne.
That's gorgeous, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is this a luxury, or is this actually quite essential to survival up here in this climate?
For the Roman soldiers, culturally, it's absolutely essential. Okay. So this tells them that they're still part of the Roman Empire. You could come from North Africa, you could come from Syria, you could come from the Balkans, from Italy, from Spain. So wherever you go, here as an example, you want to have all the accoutrements of being part of the Roman Empire, and one of the big cultural things about being Roman is bathing and having a bathhouse. So culturally, for the soldiers, it's vital.
It's like the Americans can get Pizza Hut on any military base they're at anywhere in the world.
Absolutely right, absolutely right.
And is it on a slope deliberately so that everything goes downhill?
Everything flows downhill, including at the toilets. Let me go and show you the toilets.
Right at the bottom of the hill.
Right at the bottom. And here it is. This is a Roman toilet. So you come to the Roman bathhouse, you're the soldier, and the first thing you want to do, you want to ablute.
Yep.
So you will sit right here. This is where the wooden bench was. And then everything goes into the drain below and it gets washed away into the River Tyne.
Straight off to the Tyne.
Very practical Roman engineering.
And it's a communal experience, you're just sitting side by side?
Yep, so
Chatting?
Chat, having a chat about what they're going to be doing later in the day. They're going to sort of ride out on the north of the frontier, sort of terrorise the local natives, etc. And then effectively do the equivalent for the Romans of reading a newspaper on the loo. And then you carry on your bathing experience.
If there's one question I get asked more than any other, it's how did the Romans wipe their backsides?
Well, the real answer is we don't know. But most people think they use poo sticks. So a stick with a sponge on the end. But some experts think they use other things as well. So they may have used, for example, and think about this, think about the practicalities, pine cones. So think about that, a pine cone. And we certainly know that people in the ancient world use their left hand.
Right, well, having used their left hand, they're going to want to have a good bath, aren't they?
So let's go and have a good bath. So we've been to the toilet and we're now walking out of the changing room. So the first thing you do in terms of a Roman bathing experience is you go into the tepidarium, the medium heat room. So this room opens the pores. This is the caldarium. This is the hot room, so your pores are now rarely open. You sweat everything out. You're in the far north of Britain. You're warmed up, you've got hot, and now you're going to jump into a freezing cold pool here to close your pores. That is going to wake you up. The Roman bathing experience is sort of like really builds for a military unit camaraderie because everybody's experiencing it in the same way. You'd have the officers here at the same time as the troopers. So in here, everybody's an equal.
And Chester's, like Arbea, has evidence written in stone showing exactly who was stationed in this exposed northern outpost. It's a real contrast coming in here and looking at all the carvings and the reliefs compared to the plain stonework outside.
Well, this tells us a huge amount about the people who were manning Hadrian's Wall and all the forts, and crucially, who was building Hadrian's Wall. So many of these monuments here actually record the military units who built sections of Hadrian's Wall. And here you've got 4 right in front of us from a legion called 20 Valeria Victrix.
Oh, the famous Valeria Victrix.
Absolutely, yeah. The boar, which is a symbol of Valeria Victrix. So you would have vexellations, regiments coming up to the wall to build sections, cycling through all the time, right there in front of you, their record.
And they're all carving the boar to let people know it was them. Unit pride.
Absolutely right, yeah. And here you have an example of a specific individual who served with 20 Valeria Victrix on Hadrian's Wall, right there. So this is the tombstone of Cornelius Victor, who was a Pannonian, so he was from the Danube frontier. He was the son of Saturninus. Now, Saturninus in the Roman period is a North African name. So his family were from North Africa. And we can even see his rank, and he's a very senior officer. He's the primus pilus of 20 Valeria Victrix, the most senior centurion in the whole legion. And there's his tombstone from Hadrian's Wall.
You can imagine a really grizzled veteran, 55 years old, still in the army. What a legend.
And still serving probably at the point that he died.
So he's come all the way from the Danubian provinces.
Yep.
Is that still the case later on in the empire, or are they using British troops to man these walls?
Well, towards the end of the Roman occupation of Britain, a change has taken place, because by then you've got field army troops who in Britain are based further south, and then you've got troops manning the walls, the limitani, who are effectively gendarmes, and those, the limitani, have probably been recruited locally.
So over the centuries, the troops here on the wall no longer came here from far across the empire. But even in the early days, close to Hadrian's time, local customs and beliefs had a strong influence on soldiers from distant lands who adopted British deities. What have we got here?
Well, this is a very important religious dedication, and we can tell firstly who it's been set up by. So it's been set up by the prefect of the first cohort of Batavians. So the prefect is the commanding officer. The first cohort of Batavians is an auxiliary foot unit who are based at Crowborough, and the Batavians themselves are from the Rhine Delta. They're Belgians, okay? So we know who set it up. But the interesting thing is that the deity it references is a local British deity called Coventina. So here we can see cultural transfer taking place. A unit of Belgian soldiers based in Roman Britain on Hadrian's Wall for so long that they start worshipping a local goddess.
And that wasn't a threat to the Roman Empire?
I think, actually, if you lived in the Roman world anywhere across the vast empire, if you did two things, you paid your taxes and you tipped your hat to the imperial cult, so you acknowledged that the emperor is a god, then you could do whatever you wanted to. They were very relaxed about who you worshipped, providing you acknowledged the emperor was a god.
But eventually, the world of the god emperors like Hadrian came to an end. The wall that he commanded nearly 300 years earlier no longer took orders from Rome. Around 410 AD, Britannia lost the control and protection of the empire. What happened to the great edifices built here? Back at Burd Oswald, there's fascinating evidence of how things changed in this once mighty fortress as Rome's northern grip loosened.
Here we have one of the most important sequences along Hadrian's Wall for understanding the end of Roman Britain. We're at the granaries here at Burd Oswald. So every Roman fort has 2 granaries, and those granaries are meant to feed the garrison and hold enough supplies for a whole year. At the end of the Roman period, though, there's a massive change here. So in the 370s, 380s AD, this granary that we're standing in front of here, they stopped using it as a warehouse. This is no longer a storage building, but actually a hall, like a village hall, if you will. There's some place where people gather. But that's not the end of the story, because after this building has stopped being used, they then convert the northern granary into another one of these halls, except the stone is collapsed. So they're rebuilding it in timber, with timber framing. And then there's a third building, which they then build, which looks much more like a feast hall from Beowulf. And that's what these wooden posts are. And so we're going from something that looks like a Roman fort to something more like what we think of as an Anglo-Saxon settlement.
Wow, so you're seeing that transition. It feels like a kind of bureaucratic, very military setup with the warehouse and the grain to a place where people are partying and gathering. So it feels more informal.
Yes, absolutely. And under the traditional Roman method, the commanding officer would host dinner parties in his rather nice house. By the end of the Roman period, it looks like the commanding officer and whoever's in charge is hosting parties in the hall.
Things are getting a bit looser.
We're very far from the capital of the Roman Empire at the end of the Roman period. And the imperial capital isn't necessarily paying as much attention to this part of the empire. There are problems closer to home. So the local commanding officers, they probably have to do whatever they can to maintain their authority, to maintain not only their position, but the discipline of the garrison. And if they're not getting reinforcements from Rome, if they're not getting orders from the emperor or his generals, then they're doing what they think they need to do to continue on.
It's almost like these officers are going from kind of middle management and a huge imperial organized structure to sort of big warlords.
Exactly that. And that's exactly the term we use when we talk about that late Roman to early medieval transition in Britain, that the garrisons of Hadrian's Wall are morphing into these localized war bands.
The days of the wall as a line marking the edge of empire were gone. Hadrian's visit to Britannia in 122 AD was a very distant memory, as one of the high watermarks of the Roman world. But as the wall crumbled and its stones were reused in new buildings by a new order, its memory did linger on. Rob, I know there's lots of walls in the world, but there's something about this wall that seems to have exercised a huge influence on artists, on writers. This idea that you can block off an entire island from what lies beyond.
Yeah, it's something we call a cultural afterlife, in the sense that it's had its glory days under the Roman Empire, but the wall is never really forgotten. We have medieval maps that mark the line of the wall. We have writers talking about it through the ages. The wall is almost a character in its own right in a lot of these books. It marks a transition place from civilization to barbarism, or normality to weirdness in bizarro world.
Do you get any sense of that in ancient writers?
Yeah, there's this fantastic passage in Procopius, who's writing in the mid-6th century in Byzantium, in which he talks about it as separating the north and the south. And to the north of the wall, nothing can live. It's the land of the dead. But to the south of the wall, it's a moderate climate, and it's full of abundance and growth. So in Procopius's writings, we see the wall as a boundary into the other world.
And another story in which the wall features prominently as that dividing line between light and darkness feels like the Eagle of the Ninth.
Yeah, a great story where, crossing the wall is the start and the end of the journey.
And of course, Game of Thrones features a gigantic ice-bound wall protecting the civilized lands to the south from a world of otherness to the north, peopled by the wildlings and terrifying White Walkers. We've got to talk Game of Thrones. It's got the big old wall. That's Hadrian's Wall, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the author of Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin, is on record saying that the first bit of Game of Thrones that comes together is when he did a visit to Housesteads in the early 1980s. And he looked across from the North Ramparts and just kind of imagined what it must have been like in ancient times to be standing there looking into the savage lands, as it were.
Would the Romans have recognised our modern romanticised image of that as a wall, of a kind of absolute delineation, a barrier?
I think it depends on which Romans you talk to. If you were to talk to the soldiers, their wives, their children, the local farmers living here, I think they would probably laugh at us and say, don't be silly, that's too simple. But if you were to talk to a senator in Rome, or someone working at the local baths in Rome, they might absolutely think that. It's not that different from what we have today, that people who live very far removed from the borders have a certain image of what happens at borders, whereas the people that live next to the borders have a much more realistic sense of what happens on either side.
And indeed, if they live here, they will be familiar with the humanity of the people that live on the far side of the wall as well.
Exactly.
Whereas to people further removed, if you're down in Londinium or even Rome or North Africa, you must think that what lies beyond that wall is just darkness.
Yeah, and if we think back to Game of Thrones and your cousin Jon Snow, when he first talks about the wall, and he's first approaching the wall, it's something foreign, it's very alien, but during the course of his time there, he's going to the north of it. He's meeting the wildlings and the people on the other side and realizing they're not quite so different. And so there's always that lesson that when you get close, these borders aren't absolute.
Thank you for not saying you know nothing, Dan Snow. We got through a whole day. Coming into the real wall, rather than the one of our imaginations, is a thought-provoking experience. For nearly 300 years, this was a potent symbol of what Rome could do and what it meant to be part of the Roman Empire. It's so fascinating that perhaps it's here, on the very edge of the Roman Empire, its northern extremity, that we can best understand what made that empire so mighty. The sheer scale of the remains here, the richness, the quantity from coast to coast, means we get an unrivaled insight into what made that empire tick. The massive application of military force, the monumental building and engineering projects, and the methodical repetition of the systems that underpin that empire and seen it conquer great swathes of territory and hold on to them. And it's all here, far from Rome, in the hills of northern England.
It was one of the biggest revolts in British history, a massive insurrection aimed at driving the Romans out of Britain through blood and battle. At its head was an elusive, unique warrior queen. Her name has become immortalised down through the centuries: Boudica. The year was 60 AD. The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean and beyond, stretching from modern-day Wales in the northwest to Syria and Armenia in the east. And one of the most infamous figures in ancient history then sat on Rome's imperial throne: Nero. It would be during Nero's reign that several areas of the Roman Empire experienced severe unrest, not least in Britain. I'm in Colchester, the original capital of the Roman province of Britannia, and a place with close, infamous links to Boudica's revolt. It had been almost 20 years since the initial Claudian invasion of Britain under Aulus Plautius, and since then the Romans had undergone a series of successful breakout campaigns, extending their influence further onto the island of Britain. And this had been successful through a variety of methods. First of all, through military means, through victories against famous British resistance leaders such as Caratacus, but also through some cunning diplomacy, through the handing out of substantial bribes to powerful native British rulers in the south, east and north of Britain to ensure that they remained peaceful as Rome looked to expand its control further west.
One key British ruler at this time was a king called Prasutagus.
Prasutagus was the king of the Iceni, situated roughly in about modern-day Norfolk in East Anglia. And we hear from our sources that Prasutagus, by AD 60, he had been reigning for quite a long time. He was considerably wealthy. And these two factors are probably very much linked to his close connections with Rome. Remember those substantial bribes, as I mentioned earlier, that the Romans gave out to powerful native British rulers? Well, Prasutagus was almost certainly one of those. Now, Prasutagus, he had two daughters and a wife, a queen, who we know today as Boudica. The name Boudica, it derived from the Celtic word Buda, which meant victory. And according to our sources, she was quite a character.
To find out more, I met up with Dr. Shushma Malik.
The main thing we have about Boudica's appearance comes from Cassius Dio, who was writing quite a lot later, sort of early 3rd century AD, so you're talking 250 years after these events. He tells us that she was clever for a woman, so that's something perhaps, but also that she was very wild in her appearance. She wore a multicoloured tunic and she carried a big spear. He makes a point to say that not only is it her physical appearance, but her voice as well is fierce.
In AD 60, Prasutagus died. In his will, he left his kingdom to his two young daughters, but also to the Roman Emperor Nero. It was Prasutagus' intention that, on the one hand, he preserved the Iceni's identity, he preserved the royal family, but also to keep the Romans happy. It was not to be, because enter our next protagonist, Catus Decianus, or Catus Decianus. Now, Catus was one of the most prominent Roman officials in Britain at that time. He was the Roman procurator. He was in charge of the administration of the finances. And with Prasutagus' passing, Catus sensed opportunity. With the Iceni seemingly in paralysis following the death of their king, Catus decided that this was the perfect time to strike.
Catus maintained that the money the Romans had previously given to Prasutagus was to be repaid with interest. Prasutagus and other local leaders had received money from the emperor, but also from another prominent figure in the imperial regime, Seneca.
So what's the story of Seneca's loans?
So that's an interesting story. Cassius Dio talks about this again, and he says that Seneca lent the British people a large amount of money, and actually Cassius Dio sees financial reasons as the main motivation for the Boudican revolt in the first place. Seneca lent the Britons about 40 million sesterces, which is a lot of money in Roman terms. So if you think that you need 1 million sesterces to be a Roman senator, but the daily wage for an unskilled labourer is about 4 sesterces. So we're talking huge amounts of money here. But what Seneca did was recall these loans very quickly, and he wanted all of the money back at once. And that was one of the reasons why the Boudican revolt took place.
What followed was an infamous act by the Romans. Centurions, alongside subordinates of Catus, slaves and lower officials, stormed into the Iceni territory. They sacked, they robbed, they looted. The Iceni aristocracy lost their ancestral lands. They were treated as if they were a slave race, as if they were a subject people. And even worse was to follow for the Iceni royalty themselves. Boudica was flogged, her 2 daughters were raped.
The Romans had opted to ignore Prasutagus' will, a decision they made emphatically clear through their pillaging of Iceni territory. But these infamous actions would have consequences. The Iceni were enraged, particularly their aristocracy and the ruling class. At their head was the mistreated Boudica, riling her people up for revolt to drive the Romans out of Britain.
So tell me about this remarkable speech of Boudica's in Cassius Dio.
So Cassius Dio gives her a very long speech, compared to Tacitus anyway, which is brilliant because it's a masterpiece of rhetoric, really, that he constructs for her and puts into the mouth of a woman, which is, of course, unusual, really. She starts off by talking about the freedom and the slavery that's been imposed on the British by the Romans. So do the British want their freedom back? This is the moment where they can take back their freedom. Even when you die, she says, you are still indebted to Rome. You're still having to pay them money in your wills. You've been paying taxes all your life, and then you're leaving your money to the Romans as well. Then she goes on from the freedom subject to talking about how actually if the British had just got rid of Julius Caesar back in the 50s BC, they wouldn't be in this scenario to begin with, but now is their time to redress that wrong. She then finishes the speech in an extraordinary way where she does an ad hominem attack on Nero. She says Nero is more of a woman than he is a man. She decides to rename him to Domitia Nero, Mistress Domitia Nero, which is the feminine version of Domitius, which was his birth name. So she really does then go for the jugular of Nero, if you like, which we don't see in comparable sources in Tacitus, for example. And that is a very interesting way of characterising the motivations and the impetus for the revolt as well. It's about Roman suppression in the province, but it's also about what's going on in Rome, and it also serves to make Boudica the more masculine of the two between her and Nero. So he may be a man and she may be a woman, but he is feminine and she is masculine.
Boudica became this rallying point for all of those who felt rightly aggrieved by the recent inhumane, greedy actions of the Romans. And Boudica too, of course, had suffered in those recent actions. But now her message was clear. It was time to strike back. People flocked to Boudica. The Iceni aristocracy, strongholds, and thousands of tribesmen. This was an astonishing amount of British unity, all united by a shared hatred of the Romans and a desire to expel them from the island. If the Romans believed that the death of Prasutagus would be the end of the Iceni and that the Iceni would simply accept their new subordinate status, they were gravely mistaken. Game on. Boudica started gathering her forces at a very opportune time. At that time, the most powerful Roman military force in Britain was hundreds of miles away to the west in modern-day Wales, led by our next key protagonist, the most powerful, most important Roman in the province of Britannia then, Suetonius Paulinus. Newly instated as the governor of Britain, Paulinus carried with him a wealth of military experience. He had previously led an expedition across the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, so he was the perfect choice to complete the conquest of Wales. So far, Paulinus had gained some spectacular success on campaign in the northern part of Wales. He had reached as far as the island of Anglesey, where the Britons had retreated to. It was a very important place for the Britons. But Paulinus, his campaign continued to gain success. He even burnt down the all-important sacred groves. Now, could the burning of these sacred groves and the beginning of Boudica's revolt be linked? It is possible that Boudica did have religious links. One thing for certain, though, is that Boudica struck at a very opportune time.
Boudica's first target was the nearby Roman town of Camalodunum, today's Colchester.
Camalodunum was the provincial heart of Roman Britain. Indeed, it was the provincial capital. This had been where the Emperor Claudius had visited almost 20 years earlier to receive the surrenders of British chiefs at the end of the initial invasion. And since then, Camalodunum, it had transformed. It had become the first Roman town in Britain and was the only official Roman colony on this island at the time of Prasutagus' death in 60 AD. Now, it was also here at Camalodunum that the Romans had settled a large quantity of soldiers, veterans who may well have served in the initial Claudian invasion of Britain, and who also infamously partook in the pillaging, in the raiding of Iceni territory in the immediate aftermath of Prasutagus' death. But Camalodunum was also home to a specific structure, a particular building that enraged the nearby Britons, a monumental structure that epitomised, that evoked, that symbolised Rome's newfound supremacy over this part of the island. This was the Temple of Claudius. It was dedicated to Claudius because following his death, he was deified. And as a result, we see this monumental construction appearing at the heart of Camalodunum. This temple was a source of social tension with nearby Britons. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, it lay before the Britons' eyes as a bastion of everlasting domination, a reminder of Rome's supremacy over that part of the island. But this wasn't the only Roman architectural hallmark that we see at Camalodunum. We also hear of a curia here at that time, a Roman courthouse, as well as a theatre. And all of these buildings combined, it made Camalodunum look like it was transforming into very much a Roman-looking town. And that's incredibly significant when you think that barely 20 years earlier, the Claudian invasion had occurred. Camalodunum back then had been this prominent British stronghold, but now it had become this urban symbol of Rome's rapidly growing influence over this part of the island.
It's also important to remember that it wasn't just Romans who lived in Camalodunum. Britons too lived in the town, those who were more inclined either to adopting or adapting to certain aspects of Roman culture. By 60 AD, Camalodunum had an estimated population of roughly 4,000. It was a prosperous settlement, but it was ill defended. It lacked substantial fortifications. It had ditches, but it did not have a wall. Camalodunum was an obvious target for Boudica.
As Boudica and her army gathered, bad omens plagued Camalodunum. We hear of shrieks and wails from the theatre. The Statue of Victory supposedly fell over, it toppled over, and then once on its side, it then rolled over again as if it was retreating for an oncoming enemy. They told stories that people saw apparitions, they saw visions of Camalodunum burning in the waters of the Thames estuary. Now, how much can we believe of these ancient bad omens? Well, they probably likely didn't happen. The Romans were renowned for inventing these bad omens to precede an infamous moment in their history. But what's interesting is how we're told the people of Camalodunum prepared for the impending threat from Boudica. they sent out calls for aid. One was sent to the procurator, Catus Decianus, who is then situated in London, Londinium. But Catus, he seems to have misunderstood, not realised the severity of the threat that Boudica posed, so much so that he only sent 200 improperly armed soldiers to aid the defence. But the people of Camalodunum, they also sent a request for aid to the nearest legion in Britain. And this was the famous 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, then stationed at modern-day Lincoln, ancient Linden. Now, the distance between Colchester and Lincoln is pretty significant, but there was a silver lining because in AD 60-61, we believe that there were detachments of the 9th stationed closer by near modern-day Peterborough. And it was probably to these detachments that the people of Colchester sent their call for aid. In the meantime, they started constructing a ditch and a rampart around the outside of Camalodunum, but it all proved too little, too late. By the time Boudica and her army arrived outside Colchester, the Romans had abandoned any fortifications which they had created really outside the centre of the settlement. And this was because, we are told, a British 5th column working from within Colchester had been hindering the defences to such an extent that the Romans had retreated to the Temple of Claudius, which was then the strongest structure in Camalodunum itself. Now, you need to imagine the scenes because we are told that among the soldiers there were also women, there were children, there were the old, there were the people who you wouldn't associate as being on the front line of combat action. But by retreating to the Temple of Claudius, the Romans abandoned the rest of the settlement. Boudica and her army wreaked havoc. The city was razed, the town was sacked, fire would have been everywhere. Archaeologists today, looking at the soil, looking at the stratigraphy, can see a clear burnt layer which they dub Boudica's layer because it may relate to when Boudica and her army razed this settlement to the ground. As for those defenders within the temple itself, they resisted for 2 days, but ultimately they too were overwhelmed. What followed was a merciless slaughter. None were spared. If they were unlucky enough to be taken captive, they were quickly executed soon after. Boudica's first target was accomplished. Camalodunum, this hated symbol of Rome's dominance, Rome's influence over this part of the island, was no more.
The Romans recoiled from the destruction of the provincial capital, but another disaster was quick to follow.
As already mentioned, part of the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, were stationed quite close to Camalodunum, and in the meantime the 9th's legate, Petilius Cerealis, had been gathering troops, preparing an expedition to march southeast and to relieve the pressure on the provincial capital. It proved all too little, too late. By the time Cerealis and his relief force neared Camalodunum, the settlement was already in ruins, victim of Boudica's onslaught. It would be this understrength portion of Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Legion, that would face the full fury of Boudica's army. What followed next was a catastrophe for the 9th. The relief force was attacked on the march by Boudica's army as they neared Camalodunum and were annihilated. Cerealis and only a portion of his cavalry managed to escape the slaughter, but the damage had been done. Boudica had gained her next military success.
For the Romans, news of the destruction of part of the 9th Legion, alongside the sacking of Camalodunum, was devastating. Catus, the procurator who had helped fan the fires of this insurrection, fled Britain, fleeing across the Channel to Gaul. But as Catus departed, a new hope for the Romans reached the southeast: Suetonius Paulinus. Upon hearing of the revolt, Paulinus had hurried back from Anglesey with his army, gathering more soldiers en route. Now in Londinium, the Romans and their allies looked to his leadership.
London at that time, it was a prosperous economic hub, home to roughly 10,000 people. But one key thing it lacked was fortifications. It didn't have a wall. It wasn't meant to be a defensive bastion, something Suetonius desperately needed if he was going to defend this town from Boudica and a much larger army. So Suetonius, he decided to abandon the town. He would retreat north, taking with him as many of his soldiers as possible and gathering more troops on the way. He would also take from London as many people as he could who could fight. But those who couldn't fight, women, the children, the old, they were all left behind. They begged Suetonius to stay. They begged the governor to fight for the town. But Suetonius' mind was made up. London was sacrificed. Boudica and her army showed London no mercy. They sacked the settlement and they executed anyone who they captured. According to Tacitus, thousands were executed by either being hanged, by being crucified, or being burnt alive. Cassius Dio goes into even more graphic detail. He mentions how some who were captured were melted alive in boiling water. But the worst fate befell the Romano-British and the Roman noblewomen. Those who were captured, they were taken to the sacred groves where they had their breasts cut off, according to Cassius Dio, sewn into their mouths before they were impaled through the whole length of their bodies. So far, the Romans had suffered several severe setbacks, but Suetonius now set about consolidating what strength he had. He had the 14th Legion, he had detachments of the 20th, and he also had a substantial number of auxiliaries. It was quite a significant force, but it was then that Suetonius encountered his latest setback. Perennius Postumus, the commander of the 2nd Legion stationed down in Exeter, he refused to march his legion to Suetonius' aid. He opted instead for them to stay within the safety of their legionary fortress down in the southwest. And the same story was similar for Cerealis and what remained of the 9th Legion. He opted to stay with the remnants of the 9th in their legionary fortress at Lincoln. So Suetonius, seemingly abandoned by these two legionary commanders, he had roughly 10,000 men with which to oppose the mighty army of Boudica.
As Suetonius gathered his forces, Boudica was already in pursuit, having left London a smouldering ruin. On her way, she set her sights upon at least one other settlement that she thought had been too friendly towards the Romans. This was Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. Many Britons lived in this settlement. For Boudica, it seems that her revolt had turned into a war of ethnic cleansing, aimed at eradicating not just the Romans, but also all Britons who, in her eyes, had sided with Rome. Boudica's army arrived at Verulamium and destroyed it.
By this point, Boudica's army was huge compared to that of Suetonius. The Romans were the clear underdogs, the Britons were confident. But Suetonius, despite being greatly outnumbered, he knew he could delay no longer. It was time to fight. Suetonius knew that if he wanted to battle Boudica, then he wanted a battle on his terms. And so he selected a battleground which best suited his soldiers. He positioned them on a slightly elevated piece of land, its rear protected by thick woodlands. But it was what lay in front that was most important. In the distance was a large open plain, but in front of that, and just before Suetonius' position, was a narrow defile, steeply wooded on either side. Suetonius recognized that this was a potential killing zone. It was through this defile that any attacking army would have to charge if they were to reach the Roman position. In the centre of his line, he deployed his crack elite troops, his Roman legionaries, flanked on either side by auxiliaries and finally the cavalry. And we have this deployment on good authority because our main source for the battle is the Roman historian Tacitus. And one of the sources that Tacitus was using was his father-in-law Agricola, who may well have served as an aide of Suetonius at this climactic clash. In the meantime, as this deployment was going on, the Britons had gathered on the plain in unprecedented numbers. They were highly confident. They believed victory was near at hand. And so confident were they that many had brought along their wives, their pack animals, their wagons in order to spectate what they believed would be the final decisive success in their mission to expel the Romans from Britain.
As the Britons assembled, Boudica emerged in front of her warriors, ready to rile them up for battle with an emphatic speech.
So what do we know about this speech by Boudica before the Battle of Watling Street?
So this speech comes to us from Tacitus, who's writing in about the early 2nd century AD, so a bit earlier than Cassius Dio. This is quite a different speech that Tacitus gives Boudica compared to Cassius Dio's. She's in her chariot this time, she's not standing with her spear in front of the troops, but with her in her chariot are her daughters. And it seems like she goes to each of the tribes individually and talks to them about being led by a woman. So she reassures them first of all that it's okay that they can be led by a woman, there's precedence for this, which suggests perhaps there's some differences in the reactions between the tribes. But then she goes on to talk about how she has been beaten personally by the Romans, how they've raped her daughters. It's the physical assault to her that is motivating this action. But also she talks about the broader pollution that's being done to Britain by the Romans. So the beating of other people and the savagery of the Romans is polluting Britain. So this makes it a religious argument as well as a moral argument, and therefore expands that out to the tribes, as well as her own personal reasons for going against the Romans.
Fact or fiction? I like to think that when Boudica finished her speech, a huge roar erupted among the Britons. We're told in Tacitus in response, Suetonius had his own speech for his Roman soldiers. He highlights how, yes, Boudica's army, they had the numbers, they had the quantity, but the Romans, they had the battle experience, they had the skill, they had the quality. And Suetonius' speech was generally as follows: stay alert, keep your discipline, listen to orders, and we will overcome. But for the Romans, there was another factor at play. By this time, Boudica and her army's infamous reputation must have preceded them. The sacking of at least 3 settlements, the annihilation of part of a Roman legion. The Romans must have known that if they were to see the sun rise, to see the sun set another day, then they had to overcome. They had to win.
The Britons attacked. They charged up the narrow defile, marching up through the valley, no doubt clamouring and shouting as they approached their enemy. But the Romans stayed where they were. Closer and closer the Britons came to their position. Still, the Romans refused to move. Then, at the given signal, all hell was unleashed.
Each Roman legionary had 2 specially designed javelins called pila, and as the British approached, the legionaries took out their first pilum, a lighter, longer range javelin, took them back, aimed the javelin and threw them down on the approaching British. Then soon after, they took out their second javelin, a heavier pilum, shorter range but more deadly, equipped with a lead weight. The legionaries aimed their heavier javelins and threw that down in a second volley on the approaching British. Now, as many of the Britons would have been lightly armoured, these missile volleys would have been devastating. And as the Britons were regaining their composure in the wake of this rain, this hailstorm of missiles, then the Roman legionaries went into action. They locked up their large rectangular scutum shields, they took out their short gladius swords, they formed a wedge formation, and they charged downhill into the British ranks. On either side they had their auxiliaries with their oval shields, with their spears, similarly joining in the charge with all might and vigour. The Britons, their numbers, the huge quantity of soldiers, now worked to their disadvantage. The Roman tactics, combined with the terrain, had turned them from predators into prey. At this crucial juncture, when British morale was wavering, Suetonius dealt the hammer blow. He sent his cavalry in on the sides into this great mass of British soldiers. That was it for the Britons. They turned and fled down into the narrow defile, pursued by the Romans, having received orders to show no mercy. The Britons emerged onto the plain. They struggled to get past the wagons, their pack animals, their wives watching on as they tried to escape the slaughter. But for many, it was to no avail. What followed was a horrific bloodbath. Suetonius had pulled off a remarkable but bloody victory. Indeed, when Poenius Postumus, the commander of the 2nd Legion, when he heard of this great victory gained by Suetonius, he committed suicide out of shame. Remember, it was Postumus who had refused to march his legion to Suetonius' aid earlier in the revolt. As for casualties from the battle itself, Tacitus tells us that some 400 Romans lost their lives in the battle. The Britons, meanwhile, Boudica's army, lost up to 80,000.
As for Boudica, her fate is less clear.
There are two different versions of this story of what happens to Boudica. The Battle of Watling Street has been absolutely brutal. It is a massacre. Not only did the troops die on the British side, but also the women and baggage animals as well are slaughtered too. Tacitus says that at the end of this, Boudica committed suicide. She takes poison, in fact, which speaks to her character as a female. Actually, it's women who use poison in this method. Think of Cleopatra, for example. We also get then the alternative version of history from Cassius Dio, who actually says, yes, this was a horrific battle, but there were still some Britons ready to carry on if they could be led by Boudica. So some managed to escape. They were looking to Boudica for leadership, and unfortunately Boudica got sick and she died from her illness. So this is a very different version of the story from Cassius Dio, who again has a very different motivation for wanting to give Boudica perhaps a more masculine death.
Rome learnt its lessons from the revolt. Iceni territory was absorbed into the Roman province. To assure security, military structures were constructed north of the Thames. Colchester was rebuilt and finally received its own wall. The Boudican revolt was a wake-up call for the Romans, deadly proof that southern Britain had not yet been fully pacified. Paulinus was brutal in the aftermath of Watling Street, but his reprisals only served to stir up the chance of another rebellion. Seeing this, the new procurator, Classicianus, sent word to the Emperor Nero, who in turn sent his own official to Britain to end the reprisals, a freedman called Polyclitus.
So this is interesting. This happens after the Battle of Watling Street, and we only get this from Tacitus. Cassius Dio isn't necessarily interested in the after effects of Watling Street. For him, Boudica's death is decisive. Polyclitus goes in. He has a very impressive sort of entry into the colony. He has a column of soldiers, and it's scary. It is scary. But when the Britons realise that he's a freedman, so had formerly been a slave and had been freed, they find him a laughing stock, because Tacitus says they don't understand how powerful a freedman could be. That there was this status in Rome. For them, it was all about either you were free or you're a slave. So for them, Polyclitus still had that mantle of slavery, and they found it difficult to take him seriously.
The revolts did ultimately peter out thanks to a more lenient policy of a new Roman governor of Britain. Those Romano-British client rulers who had stayed loyal to Rome, who had decided not to aid Boudica in her revolt, well, they were rewarded. Perhaps the rulers at Fishbourne and at Caleva. Now, civilian rebuilding did occur in the aftermath, albeit slowly. In the immediate aftermath of the revolt, particularly for the areas around Colchester, around London, around St Albans, those settlements which Boudica had destroyed, well, the Romans put a strong focus on military building. The Romans were determined that a revolt like Boudica's in southern Britain would never happen again.
Boudica's revolt had ended in failure. The Iceni warrior woman herself had lost her life. But Boudica's legacy lived on.
The story of Boudica is highly popular. It's become ingrained in British legend. I mean, it has it all. It has the wrongs warrior woman riling up a revolt against the superpower of the time and almost succeeding. But for me, what I find so fascinating about the revolt is the parallels we see between it with other events, roughly contemporary events we see elsewhere in the world. In the 1st century AD, in Vietnam, we see a similar revolt. Two sisters, the Trung sisters, leading an uprising, encouraging the Vietnamese to take up arms against their own dominant superpower, the Han dynasty of ancient China, which then dominated large parts of Vietnam. The Trung sister rebellion, like Boudica's revolt, ultimately ended in failure. But still, it's an incredible parallel.
The story that surrounds Boudica is one that we can see parallels with throughout world history. A figure thrown into an extraordinary position and making something of it. Taking on an imperial superpower and carving out significant success against all odds, only to ultimately be defeated. The story has inspired. The name holds steadfast among the annals of British folklore. The archaeology will discover more. The legacy will endure.
Archaeology is back. Over the past few months, over the last year in 2021, across the UK, a series of excavations have been ongoing at sites, discovering more about what life was like for these people living there hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago. And today I've come to one such site, a beautiful location situated in the heart of Northumberland countryside, roughly 1 mile from the historic landmark that is Hadrian's Wall. A jewel of Roman and early medieval archaeology, it's a place that already boasts a plethora of extraordinary artifacts, from Roman boxing gloves to early Christian graffiti to its namesake writing tablets. This is Vindolanda.
Over the course of 2021, the team at Vindolanda, including a passionate group of volunteers, have picked up the trowel once more, intent on learning more about this beautiful ancient site. I've headed up to Vindolanda to see what they found so far.
This is unbelievable.
So this is a metal cover for something inside. And what's still to come.
And it tells us that the Dark Ages are not so dark.
It'll blow us away what we're going to be finding coming out next.
Last year, I visited Vindolanda as part of a series of documentaries all about Hadrian's Wall. And ever since then, I've been itching to return to this stunning site. Now, as 2021 nears its end, I've headed north to see what discoveries they've made this year.
Welcome to the Vindolanda excavations. We're right in the heart of the site here, and this is where we've been operating
for the past 6 months.
Just before we go into this excavation in particular, talk to me about excavations at Vindolanda in general. This is like right at the heart of what you do, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 51 years now, more or less continually, we've been working at this site. We've got 100 years to go before we explore this huge place. But really, at the core of what the Trust is all about is community excavation, getting people involved in the archaeology of the site, allowing people to have the opportunity to make a direct impact themselves on the history of this planet. You know, what's better than making your own discoveries and being part of that picture, that framework of our understanding of what happened in the past.
Vindolanda as a site, it seems to have all of this history stretching centuries. There are multiple layers to this site, varying from ancient times to early medieval times.
It does. I mean, we start in about AD 85 with timber forts. By the time we get to the mid-2nd century, we're on fort number 6. We're standing in fort number 9, but that's not the end. So we get to the end of Roman Britain, or what is the end of Roman Britain, that's another question, into somewhere around the 5th century. And then we've got another 300 or 400 years of history remaining on this site, layered on top. It's a giant cake, and each layer of that cake is another period of British history. Well, Vindolanda, in essence, is a fort and military community on the edge of the Roman Empire, situated in the beautiful rolling landscape of Northumberland. It's a time capsule where so much has been left behind by so many people, still in position over 2,000 years ago, that we can learn about the detail and minutiae of daily life in a way that you can't really do from many other places.
The solution to finding out who lived in these structures and what were the purposes of these structures, and even what's the chronological order that all these structures went up one on top of the other, is truly excavation.
Lots of stunning and diverse artefacts have been discovered over the past 50 years at Vindolanda. Most extraordinary of all are the writing tablets, preserved within the waterlogged anaerobic soil layers that the site is famous for.
They are tiny sheets of wood, the size of a postcard, and the consistency of wet paper as you excavate them. So while they might not look glamorous as they come out of the soil, they tell us something that no other find can. You can tell from a piece of pot what a person perhaps ate for dinner by looking at organic residue analysis, but you can never tell from an object how someone felt about something. And the tablets really fill that gap. They tell us how people felt about things. So those are the most extraordinary finds from the anaerobic. Of course, something that really strikes a chord with the public is also the shoes. We've got a collection of 7,000 leather objects, and of them, more than 5,000 are shoes. Of those shoes, a good percentage is shoes from women and children, thus contradicting the perceived wisdom that Vindolanda and Hadrian's Wall was a place where men trumped around with their spears and their shields and did nothing but war.
From writing tablets to weapons, the Vindolanda team have unearthed many remarkable finds during previous excavation seasons, and they were hoping to find more in the Big Dig of 2021.
The first thing that we wanted to do in 2021 was to roll out the grass from the excavation area and expose all of the post-Roman and the 3rd and 4th century buildings on the site.
We also thought that it wasn't going to produce a lot of stuff because, you know, it used to be called the Dark Ages for a reason. There wasn't very much stuff coming out of the ground at the end of Roman Britain. They're not ceramic anymore. They're not using coins. The material culture that they had, they tended to recycle. But we got some nice surprises.
With their aims established, in late March 2021, the dig began. Straight away, the team set their sights on a Roman building right at the edge of the excavation area. The Scola.
Let's come through the door here and step on in to a 3rd century Scola, an officer's clubhouse, an officer's mess. So we had a little bit of this structure on show last year. We just started to excavate. But as we continue to excavate this building, this space, we really uncovered the full length of the building. More room divides, more ovens, and really get a sense of this is a sort of manufacturing place for food and for people to hang out and just have a good time.
Scolas are some of my favorite buildings. They are Amazing in that they form not only a social hubbub, but also a kind of administrative one in which the decision making, or the informal decision making, if you wish, is taking place. They really bring to life the whole idea of a community at Vindolanda for me.
It would have been a two-storey building, but of course the top story's gone. You can imagine it decked out with tables and trellises, and people eating and having merriment in here. And we got some lovely artifacts from this building, including quite a lot of coins from the space that we're standing in. Now that's useful to us because it tells us that although this is the officers' clubhouse and things would be relatively cheap for the officers to get their food and drink, they'd still have to pay for the stuff that they were being served in this building. And of course, we know from the writing tablets that people had to pay a fee to be a member of this clubhouse in the early forts and early periods. So we know quite a lot about Roman officers at Vindolanda, where we've got several names, not just from the writing tablets, but also from inscriptions on stones, and we know they had their families with them. And there are spaces in those forts, not just Vindolanda, but right across the empire, where certain classes of people don't have an official home. So we're talking about here about the quartermaster, the vet, the doctor. If they're living inside the fort, they're unlikely to be in traditional barracks. And so our officers' mess, our officers' clubhouse, isn't just a place they go to eat, it's a place they probably lived in too. And that's really, really important to find those homes for people who would otherwise be homeless in the archaeological record.
The fact that the Scola had already been partly excavated in 2020 made it all the more important to excavate this area first.
As the elements and the weather gets at the buildings and the stones, they start to degrade a little bit. So we have to excavate this building in its completeness to be able to get all of the material possible and to be able to preserve what we've got before we put the site to bed for the wintertime.
And what are some highlight objects that you discovered from this area of the excavation?
We've had everything from rather erotic Samian pottery to lead vessels with, well, little phalluses inside.
One thing about the Roman Empire, there were phalluses everywhere.
Yes, they certainly were. And, you know, they're good luck symbols. And we can probably say that people who lived in this or worked in this space were very lucky people.
Of course, from the spaces in which food was consumed, you would also expect a little bit of droppings, if you will. So bits that are not very well secured, buckles, bits of earrings, bits of brooches, things that have dropped onto the floor and that we've found thousands of years later.
I'm keen to have a look at some of these objects discovered during the excavation.
So on this table in front of us, we have a selection of our best finds from the 2021 season.
And there was no shortage of finds, unearthed from the Scola.
Here we have a lovely griffin foot. You can see there's a sort of lead plug connection, which probably would have stuck it into a box. So you can just imagine 4 of these in the 4 corners having a really cute box. So that's really quite interesting and brings it to life for me to think that someone had this really precious box with the little griffin feet.
We get all sorts of little artifacts which are associated with personal references to people's religion or their beliefs. And the griffin, of course, is an important beast, an ancient beast which guards things, particularly guards money or other things like this. Some of the occupants of that space were wealthy individuals, some of the most wealthy individuals, in fact. Every soldier is in the upper 30% of wealthy people in Britain, but the officers, of course, are a step or two well above that. So it sort of sets your imagination going. What kind of stuff did these guys have with them? What were they storing in those buildings and spaces, and why did they need a representation of a griffin, this ancient mythical beast, to guard the stuff that they had? Each artifact like that gives you a little window into a bigger picture, into a bigger scene. And it reminds you of the things that you can't see, as well as the things that are before you.
But the griffin foot wasn't the only extraordinary find discovered from the Scola.
So Marta, I mean, this is something which seems to have taken the internet by storm. What is it?
Dog lovers all over the world have just pounced on this tile. The tile itself is nothing special, but what made this tile is this lovely dog.
It's beautiful, it's really lovely. It's like this imprint from a moment of time.
Now I'm going to give you a quiz. How many dog prints can you see?
I'm guessing this is wrong, but it looks like one.
It's actually 2. How you can detect the second paw print is that there is actually claw marks right in the middle of the first paw print.
That's what it is.
So this doggy was just going for a nice run and someone shouted him off the tiles and off obediently he went.
Bricks and tiles need to be left out in tile yards and they need to dry. And so this gives the animal kingdom at Vindolanda ample opportunity to leave its footmark, its impression on us through history and through the past.
There has been a lot of research done at Vindolanda, but also wider on the Roman frontier about the domestication of dogs. We've got quite a lot of information about what breeds of dogs would have been available to the Romans, going from the rather yappy terriers used to control pests like rat, onto much bigger breeds, similar to our modern-day Irish wolfhound, which would have been used for hunting purposes.
And in terms of other pets, we've only got 2 or 3 partial cat skeletons from the site. So dogs versus cats in military contexts, well, the dogs are winning by a long, long way. And we may have had wild cats coming in and things like that, but mainly dogs. We have, of course, evidence of foxes and other wild creatures around about, deer, wild boar. It's quite a menagerie of different animals that the Romans interfaced with. But perhaps a pet that you wouldn't think of. We found evidence from the granaries just adjacent to the Scola, just across the road, where when we excavated that building in 2008, we found the little dung balls from 2 or 3 owls. Now, those owls must have been encouraged to occupy that granary space just across the road from where we're excavating now, so they can keep the mouse infestation down. It gives us a different essence, a different sense of how the Romans are using all of the landscape around them to their advantage while they're living at the site.
What is this huge object here?
Well, this is a quite hefty stone weight, flat on the bottom and an egg shape at the top. And it's got this bit of iron sticking out, which probably would have been a hoop or a hook to attach it to something.
So the stone weight is unusual to survive in such good condition with its iron still in the top of the weight. And I think personally that could have been used to attach to some bellows to help to fuel the furnaces and the fires as a counterweight. So if you're pushing up with the bellows, then you just let the weight pull the bellows down, and it keeps putting extra oxygen into the fires to give you a really hot furnace. It's quite a tight space in the Scola, the officers' clubhouse. It's only 4 meters wide, and the oven at the end of the building takes up most of that room. So you can imagine, getting a good draft into the building could be very, very difficult. So items like that give us a little bit of an indication of how, again, that space is used and some of the cute little techniques the Romans are employing to get the best out of that technology.
The Scola produced a series of interesting artefacts, but this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to do. So if this was the first place you were excavating during the season, what did the rest of the site look like at that time? What was the first layer that you had to excavate elsewhere?
Just an incredible mound of rubble. So once you get under the turf and topsoil, the end of Roman Britain is a collapsed monument of rubble and debris all over the place. It looks almost unintelligible from the ground. It's best viewed from the air, where you can start to unpick the individual buildings and work out where the Britons have built their timber structures inside the collapse of Roman Britain. This is the material put down in the post-Roman period. So you've got to imagine heaps of rubble on top of this, and then careful excavation to expose what used to be a very big rubble yard. Well, once you get under the turf, you're dealing with the end of Roman Britain and what happens next. The British people coming next are mainly putting timber construction through the end of Roman Britain. And what they're putting their timber buildings through are the collapsed rubble of all the Roman structures that came before it. And of course, those buildings are collapsing onto the street, they're collapsing inside of rooms.
The post-Roman inhabitants of Vindolanda moved things around to reuse them as foundations for timber building, sometimes respecting the previous constructions and sometimes completely ignoring them, blocking up roads and throwing out entire rooms and entire spaces.
And so you literally have a mound of discombobulated rubble right across the site.
And frankly, it's the biggest field of rocks I've witnessed in 10 years of being an archaeologist.
Getting through the rubble layer was a big challenge for the Vindolanda team. But soon, emerging from the debris, the rewards came.
So as we start to gently work back through the rubble, some structures start to appear, where you start to see patterns developing amongst those stones. Like joining the dots, you start to see a building that's long, long gone start to reappear before your eyes, as you can get a sense of where you are in that space. Ovens and other features like that start to appear, domestic spaces. And our biggest surprise, perhaps, as we came back across the rubble, was yet another apsidal structure, another church, sitting amongst that rubble at the site. Right over there, sandwiched between the buildings at the edge of this cobbled street, you've got to imagine a big apsidal structure, a church, facing west. It's church number 6 at Vindolanda.
So what do we know about these churches? And why did they come to dominate Vindolanda?
We are now at a stage in which we have several churches at Vindolanda. There is 2 main styles of construction. One is a sort of reuse of earlier 4th century structures. So you have a square room, and onto that square room an apse is bolted. However, in the quadrant that we've been investigating during the 2021 season, what we had is a different style of church, which is shaped a bit like a rocket. It's got a straight nave and an apse at the end.
We know that it had a timber building that was built across the top of it, so it wasn't the last thing that was built in that part of the site. So most likely 5th century in date.
It's interesting that those churches really start to proliferate at Vindolanda. We are starting to have more numerous churches in the rocket style than we have in the earlier basilica shape, kind of very Roman inspired. So it seems like there is an evolution in the shape of the church from something more adhering to Christianity in the Roman period to something completely different, perhaps more apt to the Celtic Christianity that comes from places like Iona.
We know now that little bit of the history of the place. We know that it's gone from being a military base to a warband centre with some Christians to a monastic base or a monastic centre in the 5th and 6th centuries. And that's a real win, because until the excavations over the last few years took place, the last part of that story was still an unfolding enigma. But now, after the work we've been doing this year and the previous couple, we can say with absolute surety that we have a monastic centre at Vindolanda in the 5th and 6th centuries.
This post-Roman Christian presence at Vindolanda was further affirmed by the artefacts discovered around the church.
We found some beautiful painted pottery, Cranbeck painted parchment ware, where you have little Christian crosses in palm leaves painted onto the bottom of the vessels. And what somebody's done in the 5th and 6th century, they've taken this very late Roman pottery and they've curated it. They've knocked off the sides of the vessels, just preserved the cross bit and kept that as a little artifact or as a souvenir, as something sacred to them.
So by the end of the Roman occupation, these symbols here become a Christian symbol. So for example, the palm leaves there, or even just a drawing of a ship becomes a symbol of God and the safe passage of the soul.
Most intriguingly of all, for me anyway, we got a very badly carved stone in the rubble of that building, which appears to carry an inscription which may say, "Yakit, here lies," which is a Christian, of course, way to explain, here lies somebody in the ground. So we've got evidence perhaps of a Christian burial nearby. We don't have a body, but we have potentially part of the tombstone that went with it.
But there was one particular artefact discovered next to the church that is truly astonishing.
One of the most interesting finds from the domestic area surrounding the church is a beautiful copper alloy lid. It's backed onto some iron, and that has really aided its preservation. This is our copper alloy lid. It's got that lovely Triskel design, and these 3 round bits there are enameled in blue and would have perhaps even contained a gemstone. We're not quite sure, but you know, they're lovely as they are. As we turn it around, we can see that it's got an iron backing. And you can see on the obverse the organic material there. There is either a bone or a wooden box, something made out of an organic material that would have been underneath this covering. But you know, the important part, let's not forget, is that this design here, this beautiful kind of three-spiral design, is originally a Celtic design. There is loads of examples of this in the National Museum of Scotland. However, it does get picked up with Christianity, so very interesting and very important Christian symbol as time moves on. And it tells us that the Dark Ages are not so dark, that all of these people who live at Vindolanda after the so-called abandonment of Roman Britain are not just savages who don't know how to read or write and have got nothing nice. They've got some pretty good material culture and they've got a pretty cozy life here at Vindolanda.
The area around the church proved a gold mine for stunning finds. And things didn't stop with the copper lid.
About halfway through the season, on a particularly rainy day, two of our longest serving volunteers, David and Richie, found a rather lovely object. So this amazing sandstone altar represents a naked figure there with his funny hat. This could be plumes or maybe a crest. He's handing a spear. There he is with a spear. And is this a horse? Is this a mule? There is real care being taken in sculpting out the hoofs and the tail and even the mane. It's looking very lovely. And the gentleman's pecs and abs are very nicely outlined. A normal military man would be pictured in full regalia and full uniform, but the fact that this figure is naked makes us think that he's a god.
It's special and it's rare for a couple of different reasons. One, archaeologically, it's face up in the ground. So to survive to the quality that it has and the definition that it has over 1,600 years is amazing. Because normally anything face up that's made of soft sandstone will be weathered away to a nub, and you'll just get a very soft impression of what used to be there. Who is it? Well, that's a different story. It could be Mars, it could be various different figures. There have been lots of speculation about that. We may never know for sure, but what is really interesting to me personally is just how well carved it is. Now, a lot of our carvings from the site, particularly when we get into the 4th century context, are quite rude or crude. They're very amateurish, to be perfectly honest. They're local representations of something else. But this has got that classical style to it, and it's very well done. So it shows us that in the late Roman period, we've still got a few people knocking around who are really good artisans and can do some very good work.
It wasn't just the post-Roman church that removing the rubble layer revealed. The outlines of other structures emerged on the excavation site, including a Roman cavalry barrack.
So this is a real maze. Let's just pop through this door and have a look at the building before me here. And look at the difference in the masonry here compared to
It's quite something, isn't it?
what we saw over there. Real higgledy-piggledy stones cobbled together. It's not a fresh quarry job like the other sections we were looking at. We've got 4 rooms here. 1, 2, 3, 4 cavalry rooms, each one for 3 cavalrymen and their horses. So much more space than you get on the infantry side of the fort. And in between the rooms and cut into the floor in the massive rubble you see before you, the foundations of those post-Roman buildings. What happened next appearing at Vindolanda on top of this 4th century barrack floor.
It's really interesting just looking at the archaeology that survives here. Not only do you have these clear-cut established rooms that you see cavalry barrack blocks, across Hadrian's Wall at Chester's, for instance,
Yep.
but also this difference in the levels and how you see building material piled on top of each other.
You do see that very, very vividly here. And trying to put this cavalry barrack on top of so much other stuff has caused huge structural issues. And you can imagine actually living in this space, if you leant against a wall too much, a bit nervous because it might just come down or fall down the other way. So eventually this building wouldn't have taken a lot of help to fall down.
Excavating this unstable cavalry barrack was the next issue on the Vindolanda team's agenda.
As we were saying, the building has been reused quite a lot in the post-Roman period, but eventually once all of that is recorded, we have to go down and underneath to understand better the occupation of the site in the early and later 4th century.
As we've worked through that rubble and established where the floors are inside the 4 principal rooms of the barrack, we've found some very, very nice material on the floor, particularly cavalry sort of stuff. So lance heads are what we would hope to find in this building, and we sure did.
There is a lot of designs for spears and lances. This one is particularly large and it's quite well preserved despite some corrosion happening on it.
It's a very thick head, isn't it? Yeah, for that lance.
Yeah, it's rather big, and one would imagine it's perhaps a bit impractical. Perhaps it's more of a showpiece, a statement piece, rather than a stabby piece.
This spearhead was just one of many uncovered in the cavalry barrack, again showing how this building once housed a contingent of spear-armed horsemen, patrolling this northern border of the Roman Empire and living at Vindolanda.
What do we think was the layout of this cavalry barrack? How would it have been arranged with the people and the horses?
So traditionally you'd have 2 rooms within each big space here. A simple division between the horses on one side and the people living on the other. And normally a big spine wall separating the 2. Now what this building doesn't have is the spine wall coming down the middle separating each side, which we have in the other barracks across the street. But we still get an essence of where people are living and perhaps animals were stabled, because we can see before us here the foundations, remains of dark earth ovens. I mean, you can imagine somebody, everything from cooking their dinner on there to warming the bottom of their hands, depending on the weather. So this gives you a sense of how this thing was laid out. Where did people live and where did the animals live?
Roman cavalry at Vindolanda is a very interesting subject. There would have been garrisons and alae posted at Vindolanda throughout its history. However, in the 4th century, it seems like the cavalry is more of a troubleshooting element of the garrison. It seems like there is 2 main types of inhabitant at Vindolanda in the 4th century. There is the so-called limitani, which are the frontier soldiers permanently based at the site, and there is the comitatenses, and it looks like the comitatenses would be the cavalry who swoops in, troubleshoots, solves the problem, has dedicated rooms that they can occupy at any given time, but isn't permanently based at the site and comes and go really as they please.
So it tells us that we've got those 2 different groups, and that some people at Vindolanda stick around and some are actually officially pulled out by the army and the soldiers. And it gives us 2 different elements to what life would be like on the community here 2,000 years ago.
From the cavalry barrack to the church to the scola. So far, the team had excavated areas dating to Vindolanda's later history. But another primary aim of the 2021 excavation was to dig deeper. In particular, to find the traces of an enigmatic series of round structures, or roundhouses, constructed at Vindolanda during the early 3rd century, when the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus came to Britain and launched a series of bloody, genocidal campaigns north of Hadrian's Wall. Finally, as the excavation neared its end, the team turned their attention to finding these peculiar circular structures. And more.
So in the last month of the excavations on the site, we decided to go down below the level of the scola, looking for the circular huts, the round houses. One of the primary aims of our excavations is to learn more about that period, but also where we could start to get a sense of what happened with the first stone fort built on the site, the Antonine fort. And sure enough, as soon as we looked for it, that building started to appear pretty rapidly. And we were very, very lucky because only in the last week of the excavation, in one particular area under the rubble yard, we also came across the trace elements of our roundhouses, our circular huts. And here we got a real surprise.
So where we're standing, this is where the church used to be in the 5th century. The church, its foundations kind of smashed the 4th and the 3rd century, which is great in a certain way because it's given us a quick view into what's below. And what's below are our Severan roundhouses. And we can see a stone curve of a wall coming out there, just on my left-hand side. And that's the footing of one of the traditional stone roundhouses that are built here, smothering this site during the Severan Wars. But what's really cool is we've got the dark stain coming around the soil here, swinging around this side. And what that is a timber version of the stone roundhouses, cutting out the stone foundation of the roundhouse next door.
You can see where that timber was really well, can't you? It survives really well, that line.
It survives very, very clearly. And you can imagine a little wattle and daub fence in there, you know, a timber version of the much bigger stone buildings. But what's cool about this is it's showing us that we've got multi-phases within that roundhouse period. This is this period of conflict, the Severian Wars, and they've got enough time to knock down the stone ones, modify the site and start putting timber ones up. So it's not just a flash and a pan moment in the history of Vindolanda, it's much more significant.
And this is the first time we've ever encountered a multi-phase in our roundhouse period, where you've got one building cutting out another.
Not only is it the fact that when we're talking about round structures here, which seems unusual in itself for a Roman fort, but also the fact you have this evolution, as it were, like with the forts of Vindolanda, from wood to stone.
So normally we get wood to stone, but here we've got stone being knocked out by wood and then being replaced by stone. So who did this? What's this all about? Why get rid of a perfectly reasonable stone house and build a little timber one instead?
And why construct them as roundhouses?
So they mirror construction of local buildings, such as the Iron Age roundhouses, which are so abundant in the area. However, the Iron Age roundhouses are generally enclosed in round ditches as well, while these ones are very carefully arranged in a very military fashion. So it's really interesting to see a round building where you expect a square one, but you know, the Romans are apt to throw some surprises into Roman forts at all times.
The last month of the excavation revealed these traces of roundhouses, but they also revealed the remnants of the first stone fort at Vindolanda, constructed around 150 AD, some 80 years after Vindolanda was first constructed by the Romans.
It seems that the change from timber to stone is connected with the abandonment of the Antonine frontier in Scotland and with the repopulation of Hadrian's Wall and the recommissioning, if you wish.
And there is that sense of permanence creeping in to an otherwise situation where the garrison would always think, we're going to be on the move, we're going to go back into the north of Britain, we're going to finish the job, and ultimately we're going to go home, wherever home is. We're going to get out of Britain because we'll have done the job and the island would have been pacified and we no longer need to stay here. Well, of course, history teaches us that never happened. They stuck around till the very, very end.
Choice get made about what stays and what goes and what forts are going to get a massive refurb and what forts are going to be ignored. And Vindolanda seems to be one of those forts that gets a really nice refurb, gets some lovely Antonine building, beautiful washhouse, amazing courtyard building with lovely opus signinum, waterproof floors. So we're privileged in that we seem to have been picked as a reasonable choice for stone refurbishment.
One area where they uncovered an interesting structure from the first stone fort was beneath the cavalry barrack.
So in this space, Tristan, looking under the cavalry walls here, you can really see Stone Fort 1, our very first stone buildings at Vindolanda, starting to emerge. And how lovely they are, how regimented, the very cute little blocks of stone. The masonry gets better the lower you go too. You know, what is this building? What is this space? That's the question that we're starting to show up here. The rooms are really cute, they're really small. So it's not a traditional barrack by any sense. And so one of the options that we might be looking at here are the remains of a hospital.
How often is it that we find a building that we can say this is a hospital at, let's say, some of these sites along Hadrian's Wall?
It's really, really rare to recognise these spaces. There's the well-recognised and well-known Housestead's example up the road, a stone-built version, and we've had timber versions here for sure. But to actually get a hospital in this period, the Antonine period, when Housestead's isn't operational, when Hadrian's Wall's not being used, of course it makes sense, because there are no other facilities nearby. And if there are lots and lots of forts operational, you don't need a hospital in every one. But if there's no hospital for 20, 30 miles, then that's a whole entirely different story.
From these earlier, lower down structures like the hospital, the Vindolanda excavation team started unearthing more stunning artefacts.
As we reach in the lowest level, as we abandon the 4th century and the post-Roman period, and we reach down into 213 and earlier, you know, the early early 3rd century, we are starting to get better preservation. And once you get to the Antonine period, to 160 to 200 AD, you start getting some rather beautiful stuff. One of the most striking finds was a beautiful millefiori brooch, and these are disc brooches which are covered in enamel which simulates a flower meadow. So as you go down, the preservation goes up and the finds become more and more intriguing, and their preservation becomes more and more surprising.
But all good things must come to an end. And for Vindolanda's excavation team, this end was the weather.
So this, Tristan, is why we don't excavate normally at the end of the season, because look at this, it's starting to open up, it's getting dark and it's only sort of mid-afternoon. But what an advantage point to look at the multiple layers of the site from here. So at the very, very bottom, we've got our 2nd century stone buildings, cobbled streets starting to come out. We're standing here on top of this very large 3rd century wall, and that in turn has a 4th century building on top. And we had a rubble yard and church over to our left. And of course all the rubble on top of the building we're standing in. This is a real multi-phased stone site we're looking at right now.
So the visitor who comes and sees Vindolanda while we are excavating, but also while we're not excavating, we'll be able to catch a cut through, a sort of section in time of what happened at Vindolanda from all the way to the post-Roman period to about 160 AD. I think it's really fascinating to walk through a place in which you have a time slice. You're traveling through time as well as traveling through space.
But what's most exciting of all is what's still to come.
So under the stone buildings in this part of the site, what we hope to find next year or the year after, but hopefully next year, are the foundations and the surviving parts of a commanding officer's house that was built at Vindolanda a good 100 years before the structures that we're looking at now, the earliest of the structures, the Scola. Now that commanding officer's house was partly excavated on the other side of the fort wall by my father in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. But at least half of the building is under the space that we're looking at now. And of course that's not the only timber building that will be there. There will be a host of buildings, 5 or 6 structures, one on top of the other, until we get down to the farmer's field that Vindolanda is sitting on in its entirety. So this is where the real excitement is going to come next, as we get into those anaerobically preserved soils, those rich deposits where not just the inorganic stuff survives, like your brooches, your bricks, your tiles, your coins, your spears, but where your boots, your shoes, your leather, your wood, your textile survives. And that gives us such a much more diverse set of tools in which to tell the story of the site.
Reaching these lower down, highly sought after soils, however, is easier said than done.
So to get through to the anaerobic level, you've got to get under the foundations of those heavy stone buildings, and that's no mean feat. We've already talked about the rubble and how challenging that is. Well, the foundations for those heavy buildings, meters of clay. And the only way to do it, well, is to roll up your sleeves, get a spade out and dig through it. It's back-breaking work.
But the rewards make it all worthwhile.
Look at that.
This is the start of the wooden preservation on the site. Now, I'm standing on a stone wall. It's the first stone fort built inside the perimeter of this one, before this one's even a thing. But that stone fort had timber versions, and what you're looking at down there is the first timber version of the Antonine fort.
No way.
So that's fort number 6. There are 5 more forts below this one. Now this gives you an idea of, looking back across the site, how low we need to go to get to the farmer's field at the bottom before the Romans turned up. How much earth material is yet to come out of the excavations.
I noticed the soil above this wooden layer. Thick. That must have taken a lot of effort for you and your team to get through.
This is hard work. This is hard work. And between every layer like this, you have another half a metre of turf and clay, and there's nothing in it. It's very, very blank. They've just put it down in a hurry. They're digging it out of the ditches to make the ditches and knocking down old ramparts to do it. So we leave a little section open like this to see how it will cope with the winter time. But also the water gives us that protective layer, slows the air down. This buys us enough time to get the job done properly.
So we've opened little windows to really check what we were in for in the next 2 years. But the real work will come when we will lift that cobbled yard and go underneath to explore those anaerobic layers.
A task that will require a lot of time and a lot of effort.
I think there is a misunderstanding that archaeology equates treasure hunting. Even the ugliest, biggest, baddest boulder of clay tells us something about the construction of the site. So don't be under the impression that we just throw some plastic explosive there and blow it all up in order to get to the interesting and cool stuff.
Well, Andrew, this has been amazing looking around the site, coming back here. So it was only a year ago we were standing over there looking at all the stuff that you were to uncover this year. Yeah. You've done that and more, and literally it sounds so exciting for the year ahead.
It does. It's very, very exciting, and I can't wait to welcome you back. I hope this time next year so you can see what's happened underneath all of this.
It promises to be a very, very exciting 2022 indeed.
The 2022 excavation will begin in March next year. Backed by an army of passionate staff and dedicated volunteers, the show goes on.
The work at the Vindolanda Trust doesn't stop during the winter. The work really goes on behind the scenes. Every year we're committed to updating our museums and putting the latest finds on display.
So my archaeological team, headed by myself, we're a small part of a much bigger machine, and the most of the people who come along and take part on the excavations are volunteers. They're giving their free time to come and join us for 2 weeks to help us on this endeavour.
The volunteers are a very important part of what we do.
We end up welcoming 300 or 400 volunteers every year to the excavations. And they're an incredible and amazing bunch of people. They have to learn the skills and the techniques and to gain the confidence that they need to do the job well. It's wonderful to see them grow as individuals and to see their experience give them so much joy and pleasure. And that helps to feed the energy that we need to keep going through a long and hard season.
We're excited about next year's excavation because we've had a glimpse of what's to come. And really, untangle the puzzle of the roundhouses. Are we going to have more? Are we not going to have more? Are they going to be made of stone? Are they going to be made of timber? And finally, under the roundhouses, that's the gaping hole, the anaerobic, waiting for us with its tantalizing secrets.
Looking at the site now, as we do, we know and understand thoroughly that the best is yet to come, because we're just about to enter the organic preservation layers of Vindolanda over the next few months of excavation. And when we do that, it'll completely change the order of magnitude of the sort of material we can get coming from this site. It'll blow us away what we're going to be finding coming out next. So it's been great. We've learned a lot about Vindolanda over the past 12 months and the past 6 months of excavation, but the best is definitely yet to come.
West Sussex has its fair share of stunning Roman sites. To the south, near the coast over there, you have Fishbourne Palace, the largest Roman residential building ever excavated north of the Alps. And up there too, on Bignor Hill, you have part of Stane Street, the Roman road which links Roman London, Londinium, to Roman Chichester, Regnum. And here you have one of the most impressive villas ever excavated in Britain, Bignor Roman Villa, beautifully preserved and home to some of the most remarkable mosaics in Britain. And I've come to have a look.
The remains of Roman villas can be found throughout southern Britain. These buildings have come to embody Roman cultural life in the countryside, filled with iconic features that wouldn't look out of place at the heart of the Roman Empire. Home to wealthy families, villas like Bignor dominated local landscapes. These were standout structures, situated right at the heart of huge estates. To learn more about Bignor, I met up with Roman archaeologist Dr. David Rudling.
David, great to meet you.
Welcome to Bignor Roman Villa. Please come in and have a look.
So David, what are these tarmac lines meant to show?
The tarmac represents where Roman masonry lies underneath the surface,
and this area was excavated by license in the 19th century, and parts of it were re-excavated by Professor Shepherd Freer in the early 60s.
And looking at the courtyard itself, when someone was approaching the villa, was it meant to impress?
Yes, so the courtyard itself, having an outer courtyard and an inner courtyard, so you've got a very much a domestic courtyard. It may be like at Fishbourne, where you actually had a guard on the inside. We don't know. Our information about the interior of that courtyard is very poor. The outer courtyard could have been a farmyard, or it may have been for things like horses, which are again a high status symbol. So if you've got visitors coming through, you're actually demonstrating your wealth en route to the main rooms.
So emphasising your wealth and emphasising your Romanness.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing about Bignor is, why does this one, as opposed to many other examples, take off and become a large courtyard villa? And but it's important to understand it has fairly humble origins, and the owner of this may well have been of British descent. To gain status, the rich elite and the farming communities would want to build in a Romanised way. And we know Tacitus tells us that the Romans actually encouraged the Britons to build Roman type houses and take a Roman style of life.
But it wasn't just wealthy Britons that were living at the heart of these grand estates. A workforce was required, not only to maintain the surrounding lands, but also to maintain the villas themselves.
And do we know about these people on the estate who weren't the owners of the villa?
Well, there would have been the local sort of Celtic indigenous stock, but there may well have also been slaves. We've got to remember that maybe a third of the population in Roman Britain was slaves. Slaves is an interesting topic today in Britain, but in Roman society it depended upon slaves. You know, the economy was run using slaves, and warfare, one of the main spoils of war were slaves. Captured people to be sold as slaves.
The hidden history of Bignor.
Villas throughout the Roman Empire were designed to impress. The elaborate entranceway was a symbol of things to come for visitors. Art and architecture throughout a villa's interior was designed to demonstrate the family's wealth and to emphasise their embracing of Roman culture. Large mosaic floors were central to this. In villas across Britain, these iconic Roman floor decorations have been uncovered, abounding with rich colours and intricate detail. And Bignor is certainly no different.
David, this is a mightily impressive mosaic.
Certainly is, and this is within the roundel we've got the scene of Ganymede, a prince of Troy who was looking after his father's sheep, and we can tell that from the shepherd's stick that he's got in his hand. He's been taken up to the gods by Zeus in the form of an eagle to be the cupbearer of the gods. But also of great interest is the fact that we're looking at Greek mythology in 4th century Roman Britain. The people that own this, one would assume that when they chose this theme that this was something that they understood. Maybe that was harking back to the golden age of classical life. Similar scenes have been found elsewhere in the Roman Empire. I remember seeing one in Paphos in Cyprus, almost similar scene to this, with Ganymede being taken up by the eagle.
Displaying impressive mosaics was not the only way a villa's owners could demonstrate their wealth. Luxurious dinner parties would be thrown for important guests, complete with entertainment fit for the upper levels of Romano-British society.
This room is almost certainly a dining room. It's often referred to as a summer dining room because there's no underfloor heating. You have at the far end, which we'll look at in a moment, an area where the diners may well have rested on couches around the central mosaic, and this end may well have been an area for entertainers such as dancing girls.
And this itself would be a water feature?
Yes, probably not a large fountain as we tend to think of fountains today, but the Romans liked the sound of trickling water, very soothing. The wealth of the owner is expressed in the quality of the mosaic.
So a room for entertaining guests and also to impress.
Absolutely.
The Romans were renowned for their holding of infamous public spectacles, and perhaps the most iconic were the gladiatorial games. Throughout Britain, amphitheatres have been uncovered, for instance at Chichester and at London, where unfortunate competitors would have fought to the death for the entertainment of the masses. This influence is clear to see on Bignor's next mosaic.
We have this strip of mosaic showing Cupids as gladiators, and Cupid, of course, was the son of Venus.
Does this tell a story, as it were?
Yes, it's a bit like a strip cartoon. So we have two different type of gladiators. We have the heavily armoured gladiator here with a sword, and another type of gladiator with a trident and net. So the Romans were quite keen on pairing up gladiators of unequal armour and weapons. And the interesting thing about this particular scene is that in between these two gladiators there is a stone block with what looks like an iron hoop attached to it. And these were blocks that were placed in the centre of an amphitheatre so that reluctant gladiators couldn't run to the side. They were actually chained in the middle or wherever you wanted to put them, and couldn't escape the action.
So they were forced to fight?
Absolutely forced to fight. The next individual that we have here, the chap with a cane, again a Cupid, he is the referee. We then have a scene where one of the gladiators, the one with the trident and net, has fallen to the ground, and the referee steps in to save the life of that individual. They then get re-equipped, and the very final scene, the gladiator again falls on the ground and is about to be butchered.
Below the mosaics, out of sight of the villa's occupants, we see the remains of another classic feature of Roman villas. A Roman invention designed to keep the room warm day and night and to add further comfort.
Well, let's focus on this hole now, because this is remarkable in its own way. It's hypocaust.
Yes, so a classic feature of Roman villas and bathhouses and elaborate houses is having underfloor heating, something that many of us actually dream of today. The floor, the mosaic, would have continued over the area that we can see, and it would have been supported on a series of pillars, which we can see replaced in the hole here. Pillar stacks, which would have been bridged with wider tiles, as we can see over here, and then a cement or concrete cement floor with a mosaic on top of that. And the idea is that the heat would come in from, in this case, behind you. On the other side of that wall, there is a furnace pit. While the owner is enjoying himself in here, in the warm, poor old Boudica is outside feeding the fire. The hot air will come in, will circulate under this suspended floor, and then go off down the channels that you can see. And if you follow them through to the wall lines, you can see where it's painted red. These were hollow ceramic chimneys that went up, box flue tiles, to the roof height, and the smoke and fumes would have escaped from there.
So these are the ancient chimneys, as it were?
These certainly are, yes.
Fascinating. Right, let's move on.
I'm astonished by the intricate detail and striking colour of Bignor's mosaics. But it begs the question, who was making them?
Literally thousands of small mosaic cubes here. Sometimes people have suggested that detailed panels may be prefabricated at the workshops. We should mention that, of course, these may be British craftsmen at this stage by 300 AD or thereabouts. We had a whole series of workshops in Britain producing mosaics. The tricky bits, like the head of Venus, may have been prefabricated and brought to the site, and the surrounding areas perhaps done by lesser craftsmen, fitting it into the room. And you can often see how mosaics have been adapted to fit a room pattern.
Fascinating. So perhaps a whole team of Romano-British craftsmen.
Figures are regularly depicted on mosaics from villas across Britain, indeed across the whole Roman Empire. Sometimes gods, sometimes mythical heroes or monsters, and sometimes personifications.
Who is the figure in the middle?
Well, the one in the middle is Medusa, and we'll talk about her later on when we look at the large baths. But around the four corners of the mosaic, we've got the four seasons, and in this case, winter is the one nearest to me. So the four seasons, very popular in Roman Britain, both with Romans and people of native origin. Four seasons would have been a significant part of the agricultural year. Medusa in the middle is an interesting choice perhaps in this context, often used as a way of avoiding evil spirits and misadventure. Let's go and have a look at the other Medusa mosaic. This would have been the changing room. So in addition to a cold room, someone has a separate changing room. And there would have been a furnace to the south of us, heating that with underfloor heating. But you can see that this one has a very nice head of Medusa here. You can see the snakes instead of hair that are coming out from this Greek goddess.
And why do you think they chose Medusa of all the figures from Greek myth?
Yes, Medusa is an interesting choice because said to be a sort of hideous female with snakes for hair, but it was a protection against evil spirits and things that might go wrong. So Medusa does occur in a number of places where you might have vulnerable actions, and a bathhouse might be one of them. So it is a suitable choice here. The excavations done in the 19th century by Samuel Lysons, when he was excavating the rest of the baths that are now buried, found a statuette of Fortuna, so the goddess of good fortune, and that was again an appropriate thing perhaps to have in the baths. An interesting discovery, sadly now missing. That was actually lost some years ago.
So may you have good fortune in the baths?
Yes.
The bathhouse was a quintessential element of Roman settlements across Britain. From Richborough to Hadrian's Wall, remains of these buildings have been found, all boasting some striking similarities. At Bignor, it's a similar story.
So David, what have we got here?
We've got a small Roman bathhouse, which would have been a requirement if you were to have a Roman type villa and really want to express your Romanness. So Roman bathing was both a social and a hygienic type activity. And what we have here in miniature is really what all Roman bathhouses have as at least the basics. So I'm roughly at the entrance. You would come into this room, which is a cold room, so-called frigidarium. It would have also been the changing room. You would change in here. It's not heated, which is why it's called the frigidarium. You would then come through into the next room, which is the tepidarium or warm room. And under the floor here, there is an underfloor heating system again. There would have been, in this apsidal area, probably basins with water or a hip bath so that you can wet yourself with warm or hot water. And then you would have come through to an incredibly more intense heat in the hot room or caldarium, and you wouldn't go any further because you'd be in the furnace and you couldn't actually go any further. But so the end room is here with again an apsidal end with perhaps basins of water or an area for bathing. You would then go back through the warm room into the cold room, but pain and pleasure go together, so you would end up having to close the pores in your skin by going in the cold plunge pool and then coming out and changing.
So it goes undressing, cold, warm, hot, and then boiling hot with the furnace.
Well, if you were stupid enough to go in there.
And does this once again tell us about the heating of places such as the baths, the fact that they had these furnaces very close by?
Yes, and of course they are a potential fire hazard. So it may be the reason that the main baths is actually at well away from the main domestic areas. But while you're enjoying yourself in here, some poor servant or slave is out there stoking that fire pit.
Roman villas like Bignor may not have belonged to the same family over several generations. If the owners fell on hard times, control over their country estate could come to an abrupt end.
Just as today people buy and sell properties, that happened in the Roman period. Properties can get confiscated by the state if you were on the wrong side of a political dispute or problem. You might have your land confiscated and it be sold by the state, or the state might keep it as part of its own possessions. We also know that in the late 3rd century there is a lot of trouble not only along the British coast in terms of Saxon pirate raiding, but in northern France there is a lot of troubles as well, and rich owners from areas like northern France may well have decided to move to Britain and bring their wealth and put it into transforming a site like this. Sadly, there was no lottery as far as we're aware in the Roman period of the types we have today, so any other major expenditure is hard to explain.
I mean, because that's fascinating in itself, because the 4th century, you normally think about the end of Roman rule in Britain, but especially during the early 4th century, this was when it reached its peak.
Absolutely, and you know, the areas in the West Country, this is where you're seeing many of the very elaborate villas being constructed there. One of the finds you'll see in the museum is this gold ring. Someone that has come to this place is someone of significance. Gold ring with, ironically, an image of Venus on the intaglio setting, so maybe another clue to the Venus mosaic. But people of status, you know, you are talking about the super elite living in a place like this. And the fact that when it was abandoned, the mosaics weren't actually deliberately destroyed. The fact that the tiled roof and the stone roof over the Venus room collapsed inwards shows that the site was actually probably ignored, abandoned, and just left to fall down. So for some reason people were keeping clear of the site rather than robbing it of the obvious riches if you wanted to take them.
Bignor's golden age did not last long. By the end of the 4th century, villas across Sussex had started entering a marked decline. So how do we think it all ended for Bignor?
So David, I've got to ask this question at the end. Why do we think Bignor as a Roman villa enters a decline? Why is it abandoned?
As far as we can tell, it was abandoned. We're not entirely sure the date of that happening. The coins and pottery that are found on the site do continue in dribs and drabs towards the end of the 4th century. It may not necessarily have even gone into the 5th century. But the fact that we've got the roof above the Venus room that was obviously intact and collapsed into the hypercourse beneath, in the southern corridor the tiled roof was obviously in situ and collapsed. It looks as though they're not systematically salvaging the site. It seems to have been left. Whether it was left with perhaps 1 or 2 farmers to maintain the estate may well have continued. You may have had an absentee landlord who, not necessarily even in Britain, you know, people owned property in different provinces and throughout the Roman Empire. So we don't know who the final owner was, why it was abandoned, but it seems to have petered out certainly by around 400 or thereabouts.